Oh, welcome everyone. So anyone who's been paying attention to the apologetics, skeptical, atheism, whatever we call it, online space recently has been anticipating this video. So if you haven't heard, Majesty of Reason, Joe Schmid's channel, has announced that he is converted to Catholicism. So I'm going to be responding to that video. And here it is. So I'll just say a few things before I start the video. It's about 25 minutes long. Obviously, I don't expect Joe to explain everything and every detail about how he's thinking about things at this point. And he's teased in this video that he's going to be releasing a very long, detailed coverage of what does he call a comprehensive case for Catholicism shortly. So I will do a response to that as well, although it may take a while to research all of the different aspects of what he talks about, as you'll see. Yeah, welcome everyone. Yes, I anticipated you would. So a few things. What I do expect, I have watched this video in advance, and I didn't much care for it, but I'll explain why. So as I said, I don't expect him to cover everything in full detail. What I would expect, and what I think is reasonable, let me just move this for the moment. What I think is reasonable to expect of something like this is key highlights of how one's thought has changed. Obviously, when one is going from being an agnostic, like public YouTube persona agnostic, to being a Catholic, what we would reasonably expect is highlighting key areas where your thinking has changed, aspects where you didn't appreciate this argument before, or you learned about a new view, or your perspective on this particular rebuttal has changed, something like that. And this video does a very poor job, in my view, at developing those thoughts. We get only the barest details. And really what most of the video is an avalanche of what I think are just absurd claims about Catholicism and various types of miracle, some philosophical claims, but mostly sort of miracle claims that are alleged to support Catholicism. Now, I've not looked into the vast majority of these. A few of them I have looked at. I guess that will be my work will be cut out for me over the next however long, because it takes a long time to look into these things properly. But anyway, the point is that this is why I titled this video the way that I did, Slopologetics. I think I've sort of dabbled at this idea before, but I'm increasingly seeing more of this, where the strategy is essentially to just overwhelm the viewer with an avalanche of poorly developed or uncritically evaluated claims, often miracle-style claims, but not exclusively. And so just like, we have this problem with AI slop, which is low quality but easily generated, and therefore content that is therefore available in huge quantity. We also have this problem with apologetics. And this is not a new phenomenon, but perhaps I'm seeing a little more lately. And it's really disappointing from someone like Joe, who has built a reputation on careful thinking and evaluation of arguments rigorously and so forth. And I don't want to say he's never done that, but you really don't get any sense of that in this video, or at least I don't. And that's why I also said that he seems to be a profoundly unskeptical or uncritical person, at least in respect to the claims that he's talking about here. So anyway, that's my editorializing. I'm just explaining the thumbnail and the title and what I would expect out of a video like this. And so let's get started. I think we'll go through the whole thing. It's not too long. I will maybe just bump up the speed a little bit. Here we go.
Big news! God exists. Christ is Lord, and he established the Catholic Church. I'm not kidding. I just converted to Catholicism. Well, actually, Joe, you're just a revert, so that's technically misleading. My dude, conversion is a change of heart and mind. And that just happened. For those of you who don't know me, shame on you. I'm Joe Schmid. I'm a PhD student in philosophy at Princeton University, and I've been an agnostic and public critic of theism and Catholicism for quite some time. But earlier this year, that all changed. So today I'm just going to share my personal journey. If you want my hours-long comprehensive case for Catholicism, stay tuned. That's coming very soon. Oh, and I also have some cool things later on in the video, so stay tuned. So I grew up in a devout Catholic household.
This is something I didn't know, actually. I didn't know that he was raised Catholic, although it's not uncommon for public critics of religion to have a religious upbringing, but that's just something to bear in mind. So just having a quick look at chat here. I do agree, though. His Zizek impression was very impressive. He seems to be quite good with impressions, so I'll give him that one. Let's keep going.
I went to private Catholic school from kindergarten through 12th grade. I frequented the sacraments. I prayed all the time. I was totally into Catholicism. Everything was like smooth sailing in my faith. In fact, I was like really devout until maybe around like 7th or 8th grade when I had the first wobble. So in 7th or 8th grade, my Catholic school taught us evolution. And thankfully, Catholics are totally down with science. So they're like, yeah, we can teach you guys evolution. I mean, there's like so much scientific evidence for it, and it's totally compatible with Catholicism. But
well, Catholics are down with science more than other Christians, but I wouldn't say they're totally down with science. I mean, we'll see some of that later, perhaps. But anyway,
it did cause me to start wondering, like, how do I mesh this with my commitments concerning Adam and Eve and Genesis? Like, how do I make sense of that? That bubble didn't last too long because I came across the work of people like Francis Collins and the Biologos Institute defending theistic evolution. And I also started appreciating that, Genesis, although there are historical elements to it, its genre is something like mythopoetry.
So this is interesting because he's talking about, he is talking about objections to, who should I make bigger? I'll make him bigger. Here, Joe's talking about objections to Catholicism that he had when he was young, 12 or 13, I would guess. And he's sort of emphasizing how specific ideas that he encountered, or he's explaining how specific ideas that he encountered led him to then think differently about those objections. Now, this is important because although this is fairly brief, this is really the only time in the video that he does this. When we'll see later on when he starts talking about his journey from, he's actually unclear about, he calls himself sometimes agnostic and sometimes atheist, which I find confusing, especially since I debated him years ago about the use of that term there. But anyway, he doesn't really explain how he changed his mind. He just sort of throws a bunch of claims at us, which I think is disappointing because this first part of the video, he explicates, I think, or demonstrates more or less how I would recommend going about this. Like, here's what I thought, here's the objection I had, and here's the specific claims or different way of looking at it that led me to think differently. He doesn't really do that later on, which, again, I'm contrasting that with what he does here, which I think is at least a much better.
With some, theological and historical aspects sprinkled in. And so I was like, okay, I can see accepting evolution together with what Catholicism teaches about Genesis and human origins. But then, nearing the end of 9th grade, I really started reflecting further on the evolutionary process.
Being savage as usual.
And in particular, I reflected on the brutality of it. I mean, for hundreds of millions of years, animals were just like ripping each other to shreds and just suffering and languishing. And it was just so hard for me to mesh that with belief in an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God. This problem of evolutionary animal suffering just like gnawed at me for quite some time. It really bothered me. And, one thing led to another, and soon enough, I was just like voraciously consuming debates and content online concerning theism versus atheism and Christianity versus non-Christianity and whatnot, So I was just like watching William Lane Craig debates and watching the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins.
William Lane Craig mentions, take a shot, everyone.
And Daniel Dennett, etc., right? Those dirty new atheists, right? That was a joke, okay?
Really good impression. Someone was mentioning that in the chat. I think he's been known to do impressions before, actually. I think he should spend more time doing that. Maybe less time reading religious apologetics online because he's very good at the impressions. Now, I want to take a moment here. Remember that he just told us that one of the main reasons, well, he hasn't actually said that he's deconverted, but he's in the process of the deconversion in like late high school is where we're at. Now, he said that one of the big reasons for that was animals suffering over the course of evolution. And I think that is a good reason to be skeptical about the claim that, God created the universe and designed it all for the existence of sentient life and so forth, and that he's all powerful and all omnibenevolent and all that. So I think in broad brushstrokes, that is a good objection. Joe cites it as one of his major reasons for deconversion. So it would stand to reason then that upon reconversion or in the process of reconversion, one would expect some sort of response. How is his thinking changed about animal suffering? Why does he no longer consider it to be as substantial or as formidable objection as he previously did, right? I mean, that would be presumably the sort of thing that you would expect out of a reconversion story like this. Unfortunately, no. Joe never mentions this again. He doesn't mention this in the video. He doesn't explain it. I'm not saying he hasn't thought about it, right? I'm sure it'll... What I'm saying is it's a major omission in a video like this to say that your major reason for deconverting in the first place was X and then never address X again, even after reconversion. That's just really sloppy work. Like, I don't understand how you can work on this video and that this is your big announcement and not address that point. Because as, a skeptic, a naturalist, and atheist, I'm wondering, well, yeah, Joe, that was a good objection. What do you have to say about that now? But we just don't hear anything about it. I was very frustrated because I was expecting he would come back to this. Alas, not.
Thelma. After some time, the problems for theism and Christianity just kept mounting and mounting, and eventually, I lost my faith. That happened sometime around 10th grade. I came to conclude that atheism is true, so God does not exist. And I also thought that naturalism is true. So, at bottom, the world is just fundamentally indifferent. There's no fundamental purpose. There's no fundamental mindedness. At bottom, as Richard Dawkins says, it's just blind, pitiless indifference. The natural world is all that there is. At the time, I thought that was just the best explanation.
This quote here is one that theists like to mention, and I think it's an interesting one, and it's partly why I'm writing my book in a defense of naturalism. And I think that the world really needs this right now, because we have people. I mean, Joe hasn't explicitly said that he has reverted to theism because of thinking that this sort of viewpoint is sort of too depressing or something like that, but he sort of hints at it now and then later on when he talks about his experiences with Christ and sainthood and stuff like that. So I suspect that that's at least a part of it. The thing is here that I think the quote, well, look, I don't know what Richard Dawkins had in mind when he said this, but that doesn't matter. On the face of it, the quote is entirely metaphysically unobjectionable from a naturalist point of view, and really tells you nothing about like the plausibility or what attitude you should have to naturalism. All it says is that under naturalism, minds, intentions, purpose are not fundamental, right? They're not part of the most basic building blocks of reality. And every naturalist is going to agree with that, right? And interestingly, some theists seem to agree with that when they make certain arguments, but then flip when they make other arguments. We'll come back to that later. So I think theists are inconsistent here, including Joe in this video, about whether meaning and mentality of things are fundamental or not. But look, the key point is something doesn't need to be fundamental to exist or to be important, right? I mean, I'm talking to you using a microphone. Microphones aren't fundamental on naturalism or most worldviews at the very least. They're made up of more basic things. They're composite. They're not fundamental. The English language isn't fundamental. Cheese isn't fundamental. Like any number of things aren't fundamental. That doesn't mean they don't exist. They don't matter. They don't have importance. So this notion of fundamentality is, I think, there's a sort of a fetishization of fundamentality. That's a nice turn of phrase. I like that. That if something's not fundamental, then somehow it like doesn't exist. I think that this is sort of like a misconstrual of what reductive naturalism is like. That if you reduce one thing to something else, then somehow the thing you've reduced doesn't exist, or doesn't matter, or is fake, or made up, or something. Now, I don't want to say that Joe is committing that fallacious reasoning, although we're not given any reason to the contrary. The way that he's expressed this, I think, is lending you to think this. But it's something I find very frustrating, and I'm commenting on it because Joe's mentioned that quote without any commentary, and leads me to suspect that he may sort of buy into this idea. Just because on a certain worldview something is not fundamental does not mean that it doesn't exist on that worldview or is not important on that worldview. And that's something that needs to be understood from any defense of naturalism. And I don't think Joe evinces a good understanding of that in this video, as we'll see. Anyway, let's move forward.
The data. But then, in the summer before senior year, I stumbled across this YouTube channel called A World View Design. And I was just captivated. Like, I started watching these videos and I was like, whoa, these are like some new arguments for theism that I've never come across. And the host behind the channel was just like super loving, but also incredibly intellectually rigorous and sophisticated. So I binge watched all.
I've never found Josh Raspberry seem to be particularly. He is a nice enough guy. He seems to be. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with him before. I've responded to some of his videos. I've never found him particularly rigorous or insightful, but maybe that's just me. Now, a question from chat here. Whoops. Would I invite him for a conversation on this? I'm always open. I have an open standing invitation for any thoughtful person who has substantive points to make, who disagrees with me. They can come on my channel and discuss that with me. So that would be for him. That would apply to him as well. I would say, though, that it would make sense to wait until he's released his big defense of Catholicism. I've had time to work through that, and realistically, that takes months. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be good if he's interested in doing that, or we could host a debate on a different channel or something like that. But anyway, yes, in principle, I think it's very important to be open to criticism and challenging of your views, speaking from my point of view. So I'm always open to critics to come and tell me why I'm wrong. Oh, that's cool. That'll be interesting. I'll have to check that out. Let's keep going.
All his videos, and whoa, they just opened my eyes to this new world of like academic theist philosophy. So the person behind the channel, as I came to discover, was Dr. Josh Rasmussen. He's a Christian philosopher. And at the time, he was publishing a book with Alexander Poots called Necessary Existence, defending all these new and interesting contingency arguments for God's existence. And he was just like popularizing and publicizing that cutting edge work in his videos. And so, after I binge watched these videos, I was like, whoa, there's way more to theism than I thought. There are all these new and interesting arguments that seem really forceful to my mind.
I don't think much of those contingency arguments. I have responded to some of them in the past. I've not read that specific book. One of the things that I have been critical of Joe in the past is the pedestal that he seems to put academic philosophy of religion / theology or academic apologetics on. And the way he talks about these arguments, new and cutting edge and things like that. I mean, some of them are new in some respects. People do work that is development of old ideas. But just so much of it is very repetitive, in my opinion, very repetitive, very derivative, and just profoundly uninteresting. A lot of it just relates to sort of silly language games and speculation about, based on building one intuition upon another, about like the possibility of whether infinities can exist, or the possibility of like an infinite chain of causes, or whether something requires an explanation. And I just find all that to be well, I shouldn't say all of that. There's a good way to do some of that, but there's like very lazy ways to do that. And a lot of that, Nathan and I talked about this in the video we did on the apologetics industrial complex. Joe seems to be sort of profoundly unskeptical about the economic incentives behind a lot of this work, which is directly or indirectly funded by basically people donating money to their churches, or other apologetics institutes directly. And, that they then fund like the private evangelical universities that employ these faculty, or that they give them research grants, or that they pay to publish, to write the books. They run the journals, all this sort of stuff. It's a big industrial complex. It has a lot of money behind it. And their whole purpose is just to churn out more and more arguments and popularize existing arguments to make people feel more secure in the faith. And I have a lot of criticisms to make of that, because I don't really think much of any of it is truth driven. I think a lot of it is just sort of churning through the same basic set of ideas, but with a new sheen on it, particularly appealing to science in misleading or unhelpful ways. So I'm much more skeptical about that than Joe is. Now, I'm not saying that all philosophy is bad, or that like there's never anything useful that comes out of these journals. No, that would be too strong. But I do think that there's a lot more sort of systematic criticisms to make of it that I think Joe just broadly doesn't levy these sorts of objections, which is one thing I find frustrating. And I seem to think, well, as we'll see, let me know if you guys can hear that thunder, by the way. There's a storm coming on here. Hopefully it's not coming through the microphone. Divine retribution is coming for nasty atheists like me. But anyway, I think about things in a much more sort of scientifically minded way than Joe seems to. We'll see that later on in this video. So let's keep going.
Hey, I still got some objections. So I reached out to this mysterious person whom I didn't know at the time. I was like, "Dear Dr. Rasmussen, I recently been binge watching your videos, and I was like, I have some objections. Can you help me?" And so then we just had this extensive email correspondence going all throughout my senior year. And eventually I was like, yeah, there just is a lot more going for theism than I thought. And also, just being introduced by a professional philosopher who knew a lot more than me, who was just like utterly mogging me intellectually, just revealed to me that I think I'd prematurely judged the question of whether God exists. And so as a result of coming across these new arguments and dialoguing with Josh, I was like, okay, I can no longer maintain my competent naturalism. I think I should suspend judgment on the question of whether God exists. So I should neither believe that God exists nor disbelieve. And the evidence at the time just seemed to me maybe roughly counterbalanced. Maybe it's difficult to tell which way the evidence points.
Oops, didn't mean to do that. All right, so who can tell me what is missing from... Now, I know he's like 17 or 18 at this point, but he said he's in senior year of high school. So maybe I'm asking a bit much, but nevertheless, he's putting it out here. And so I'm going to raise a concern here. What is missing from what Joe has said? Let's review. He was a theist. He came across some arguments which convinced him, evidences that convinced him, or that led him to lose his faith, let's say. So now he became a naturalist. Then he started dialoguing with Joe Rasmussen, who provided a bunch of arguments for theism. That convinced Joe that he couldn't maintain his confidence in naturalism, so he's now becoming agnostic. Can we see what's missing in that sort of discourse or dialogue there? Yes, the naturalist case. So he's dialoguing with a prominent philosopher apologist, and who's providing all of these arguments for theism. Okay, that's fine, nothing wrong with that. But where's the dialogue with the naturalist philosopher, with the Oppie or whoever else, right? Who's providing the counters and the case against theism? in order to say, I mean, he's specifically becoming an agnostic at this point, that he's saying the case is about even, but he's only claimed to have experienced. I mean, he did say he watched a bunch of videos, right? But dialoguing with someone on for an extended period is a much higher level of engagement, right? So he's had that high level of engagement with the theist, but evidently not with the naturalist. I mean, maybe he did, but he's not telling us. That would be kind of weird. But I mean, this is the point, right? And this is why I'm going to keep coming back to this. Why do I call him unskeptical? Because this is not a skeptical thing to do. If you're trying to find the truth, and you're concerned about a particular question, you look at what both sides have to say and try to evaluate that and integrate that together. I'm not claiming that he didn't do that at all. What I am saying is that in his own account of it, he makes no mention of this. He only says he dialogued with one person who was, prominently defending one side of the question, and doesn't mention dialogues with anyone on the other side. That is not what a good skeptic does. We will see this is a recurrent pattern, evidently, with Joe in his own account of it.
Points. But as a result of all this, I became a kind of settled agnostic, maybe somewhere around the end of 12th grade. And that
Rasmussen is easy to friend, though Oppie is quite reserved. Yeah, look, I mean, it may be easier to find Christian apologists to dialogue with. There's many more of them than the atheist or naturalist philosophers. Why is that? Well, I think large part because of the apologetic industrial complex. But that's not the point. The point is, if you are trying to find out what's true, you need to go to the effort to make sure that you can try to balance these issues as much as you can. If you're going to say that there's approximately equal reasons or evidence on both sides, you need to make sure that you haven't tilted the scale one side or the other. And one way you can do that, for example, would be to dialogue extensively with an eloquent defender of one view without doing that for the other view. So it may not be as easy to do that for the naturalist case, or there may be other barriers. But that doesn't change the epistemics of the situation.
That state of agnosticism kind of just like stably persisted all the way up until grad school. But somewhere around the end of my first year of grad school, or maybe the beginning of my second year in grad school, things started to change a bit. I started coming across these like new and interesting arguments for theism that like seemed to me pretty forceful. And I also started losing some objections that I previously had to theistic arguments that I thought failed. So over the course of my first, 1 or 2 years in grad school, I started leaning towards theism. I started seeing theism, the view that the fundamental nature of reality is just like pure, limitless perfection. There's this perfect being at the foundation of reality with every perfection to an unlimited extent. I started seeing this view as a relatively simple, coherent, non-arbitrary, elegant hypothesis. And not just that, but a hypothesis.
So I don't even know what to say to things like that. At fundamental reality, what exists is like limitless perfection. Like, I just have no idea what you're talking about, Joe. Like, can we unpack that? And part of the Christian view is that, we can't understand God, right? He's ineffable in large respects. So, I don't know exactly what Joe would say about that. But like, this is a simple, eloquent view. Like, it's word salad. It's word salad as far as I'm concerned. I mean, obviously there's going to be more to say to it, but like, I don't know. Like this is the simple view. I mean, okay, all right.
It offers a unifying explanation of a vast and diverse array of otherwise highly striking data that other hypotheses either have to explain piecemeal or do a very poor job at explaining.
All right, now this is something I talked about in my previous video. Remember I talked about miracle claims? Now, Joe's not just talking about miracles here, like he's going to talk about fine-tuning and other things. I mean, I guess in some sense, every action that God makes could be thought of as miraculous. But anyway, the point is, in that previous video, I discussed how when you're invoking a divine explanation for some sort of miracle or divine intervention or divine action, because of the nature of God as perfect and all-knowing and all-powerful, the usual means by which we explain with reference to intentionality or agency, like human explanation or even maybe an animal or something like that, they don't apply, because God doesn't have the normal limits, constraints, or typical motivations that people do, or even animals do, or maybe even that intelligent aliens would. So most of the avenues we have to explain by reference to agency aren't applicable to God. Really, all we have to, the only things we can appeal to are why would God, like explaining why or invoking a reason why God would adopt a specific intention to do a specific action, relative to infinity of other actions he could have taken at that time. And B, why would he use a particular means to achieve that? So there's why did he adopt that end and why did he adopt that means? And that's all you really have, because there's no other constraints that are operative upon God. Now, so that's important, because if Joe is to tell us that theism is a coherent explanation for a wide body of fact, okay, which is fine. I think that as an approach, that's what you'd want it to be. So I'm on board so far. But what we need to hear is what intentions did, what ends did God adopt, and like why did he adopt those ends that account for the facts relative to all of the other ends that he could adopt? And then B, why did he adopt the specific means to achieve those ends? So let me just give an example to make sure you can understand my point. So suppose you were to say that God fine-tuned the universe for intelligent life. So the first question is, why would God adopt the end of creating intelligent life or sentient life or conscious life? Why would that be something you'd expect an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being that it has perfection at the foundation of reality? Why would that be something that he would do relative to all the other things he could do? And then the second question is, why would he adopt the means of fine-tuning a specific set of natural laws to bring about that life? Okay, so that's what your explanation is going to consist of, the end and the means. And you're going to need to postulate some sort of reason or explanation as to why we would expect to see these things under theism. And then we're going to weigh that against whatever alternate explanation there is for, alleged fine-tuning. So without, jumping into that debate right now, that's just an illustration of what an explanation is going to look like from theism, what an explanation should look like. Now, what I've been critical of, especially recently, and I talked about in the last video, is that theists almost never do this, or at best they do it half-heartedly and very poorly. They just, basically what they do is they announce a fact or declare a fact. I mean, sometimes they try to argue for it more than others. And then they proceed to try to debunk or criticize alternate naturalistic explanations for that fact, or at least non-theistic explanations. And then somehow just like God wins by default, or theism wins by default, or Christianity wins by default, depending on the specifics. And almost never is there an attempt to actually give an account as to how theism or Christianity or Catholicism actually accounts for those facts. And here is exactly what I think Joe is doing. Well, he hasn't done it yet, but this is what he will be doing. He's telling us that theism provides a unifying explanation for these phenomena, but he never tells us what the explanation is. And you'll see. He identifies, again, I don't expect full details here, but I expect something. I expect some effort to highlight where the explanatory power comes from, and we just don't get that. So let me show you. Or
have to take us through facts. And so this kind of meta argument for theism that on the one hand, it seems to be a relatively simple, elegant, coherent, non-arbitrary hypothesis. And on the other hand, it provides this wonderfully unifying explanation of a vast and diverse array of pretty strikingly fortunate data. I started leaning towards theism. And what data are we talking about? Well, there's too much to explain, and I explain it all in significant depth in my comprehensive case for Catholicism that's coming out very, very soon, so stay tuned, stay finely tuned. Come on, that was a good one. But just to give you a glimpse into some of the data that really started pulling on me, I mean, I already had in the
So here he's talking about the data that theism allegedly explains.
Background, a decently high confidence that there's some kind of necessary foundation to reality, so some kind of ultimate reality that could not have failed to exist. And I at least lean toward that view on the basis of the various contingency arguments that I mentioned earlier on from Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen and various other philosophers like Rob Koons, etc. So I already had that in the background. And then the question was, well, what is this being? Well, maybe let's examine the character of its effect.
Yeah, so just on that point, I mean, I think that these arguments for necessary cause are not very convincing, but that by itself doesn't really favor theism unless you add additional assumptions, because, of course, I mean, Oppie's been a proponent of this, that there's any number of possible necessary causes or necessary grounding that you can postulate that are consistent with naturalism as well. They just have to be physical in nature. So Joe doesn't mention any particular reason at this point for thinking that that's personal or that that's a deity, but that's about what he's going to go into. So this is the part where I more have the issue with.
And when we look at the character of its effect, it's just utterly saturated with extremely fortunate coincidences that had to happen just right for basically anything interesting or valuable to occur in the world. So it's striking to begin with that there are any laws of physics at all. But let's suppose there are. Even though
why is that striking? It's not clear to me why is that striking. Depends how you understand laws of physics, but anyway, let's move on.
It's pretty surprising that those laws of physics have constants that even have life-permitting ranges to begin with. I mean, after all, we can imagine hordes of different laws, many of which are much simpler than the laws that we have.
Okay, this is another, well, in my opinion, it's a mistake or a methodological problem that I've seen Joe commit before. So notice how he said we can imagine there being different laws, I think, or different constants, actually, I think he was saying there. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to this we can imagine point later.
Actually have, which would preclude basically anything interesting or valuable happening. Basically it is a law that there's a single particle which just vibes for all of eternity. You're not going to get anything interesting or particularly valuable in such a world. We didn't get a world like that. Instead, the law structures that we have are at least compatible with life. And not only that, but these law structures, the form of these laws, they contain certain constants or fixed values. And those fixed values need to fall within exceedingly narrow ranges in order for life or basically anything interesting to develop. So we sort of hit the complete cosmic jackpot there. And then even then, we weren't done. In addition to that, the laws of nature actually match the contents of the universe so as to result in temporal evolution. And then even when you get temporal evolution, it's surprising that conscious subjects evolve.
All right, hang on. Someone thoughts on previous 2 comments. Frotan Inferno. Unfortunately, I can't see your comments. Were they way back? Maybe just... Oh, wait. Oh, here we go. Is it not hasty to conclude he hasn't dialogued a lot with the best of naturalists, non-theists over most of his work? No. So that's not what I said. I didn't say that he hasn't done that. Remember, what I was saying specifically is that in his story of his... in Joe's story of his... I guess the process of reconversion from naturalist to eventually Catholic, he first went from naturalist to agnostic. And what I said was, in his own account, that was based essentially entirely on dialoguing extensively with Josh Rasmussen. And that led Joe to think that the evidence for theism and naturalism, or sorry, for theism and non-theism, I guess, was roughly balanced. My point specifically was that that is not a very sensible inference to make if you haven't also dialogued comparably extensively with someone on the other side, with a naturalist philosopher, or at least that's something you'd want to worry about. Now, I'm not saying that he hasn't done that since. Maybe he has. I'm specifically talking about how at that point in his journey, there seems to have been an issue with evaluating evidence effectively. And, you know, maybe he would agree with that. I don't know in retrospect. He hasn't told us, but he didn't present it as if that was any sort of problem. And I do have a problem with that. I think that that's a real issue with, if somehow people just don't recognize this, that if you're constantly immersing yourself in one way of thinking about things and not looking at criticisms to that and exposing yourself similarly or engaging similarly, then there's going to be generally a bias pushing you in that direction, or at least that's a factor you want to consider. So that's the specific criticism that I'm making. I'm not saying that he's never since dialogued with naturalists. Hopefully that's fairly clear. Anyway, so let me just jump back a couple of seconds here. He's talking about fine-tuning.
And then even then, we weren't done. In addition to that, the laws of nature actually match the contents of the universe so as to result in temporal evolution. And then even when you get temporal evolution, it's surprising that conscious subjects evolve, because we can imagine a world which is physically just like...
Okay, we can imagine. That's the second time.
Ours, but where consciousness doesn't exist. And so it's actually quite striking that consciousness exists. And not only does consciousness exist, but it's paired very fortuitously with the physical world. Our mental lives are strikingly orderly and coherent and intelligible and rational, given our physical states, functioning, and behavior. If you think about like the vast horde of conceivable ways of pairing up conscious states.
So here he's talking about psychophysical harmony, or at least I mean, that's what he's describing. He doesn't use that term. So fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony. I'm not expecting him to fully develop these arguments here, but there is something that I do expect. And let me try to draw that
physical states
together.
Only an exceedingly tiny portion of those actually lead to consciousness involving goods like rational agency and meaningful relationships and virtue and enjoyment and aesthetic experience and so on. And then we have moral knowledge, and it's really difficult to see how that could be the case under naturalism because the moral facts don't explain.
Okay, so now he's talking about a type of moral argument relating to moral epistemology, which is a rarer one, but I've seen it before.
You know, moral judgments under naturalism, and then we also have a priori knowledge that a bunch of different people are experiencing God. They have religious experiences, and then beauty is just saturating the world. Beauty. And so I just was reflecting on all these different pieces of data and all the coincidences that I'd have to stack one on top of another in order to remain an atheist. And that was just...
See, here he just says remain an atheist, which confused me, because here he's definitely talking about like post-reversion to... Sorry, not reversion. He's talking about post-conversation with Rasmussen, which evidently was when he became agnostic, and now he's saying atheist. So I'm a bit confused there, but I mean, it doesn't really matter.
It's getting difficult. I still didn't go all the way to theism.
Okay, so let me pause there. He mentioned a number of facts. So there was fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, moral knowledge, beauty, and a priori knowledge, I think were the 5 main ones. So there's 5, let's call them facts for the sake of argument. And he evidently thinks that naturalist or atheist, slightly unclear exactly what position he's talking about here, but at least a non-theist position can't account for these very well, and he would have to like stack coincidences on top of each other was the way he phrased it. I think this is a bit sloppy. Even in a 25-minute video, we could do a little bit of a better job at highlighting major concerns. I mean, yeah, this is an important video. He's presumably planned this for a while. I don't expect him to outline everything, but I think we could do better than just like throwing them at the audience in a few seconds there. I find that a bit sloppy. But the main concern that I have here is what I was saying before about explanations. He said, Joe's told us that theism provides a unifying simple explanation for this, for these things. But he hasn't even attempted to tell us what that explanation is. Again, I'm not expecting a full detail, but a little summary, something would be nice. We're just sort of expected to just vibe with him or something, that theism explains these things, explains fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, a priori knowledge, moral knowledge, and I forgot what the other one was. But I mean, it's not at all clear to me that it explains any of those things, at least not better than rivals, because you have to invoke specific divine ends and then means towards achieving those ends that are consistent with the facts, and how plausible are those relative to other possibilities. And I think when you do this, it becomes much less clear. Certainly in the case of the fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony, I'm not as exactly sure how he would run like a priori knowledge argument. I'm not actually sure what that has to do with God at all. But anyway, the point is that we're not actually given even a like prima facie reason to accept theism on the basis of what Joe has said, even if you accept completely all of the facts that he's outlined, right? So I'm not talking about him not going through like the fine-tuning or psychophysical harmony in a lot of detail. But I'm just saying we're not even given a prima facie argument as to why these things are better explained by theism than an alternative. It could be that theism just has just as much of an ad hoc coincidence stacking explanation that just appeals to God instead of not God. I tend to think that that's the case, right? But we should have at least some sort of acknowledgement as to what the explanation is supposed to consist in, how in broad outline it works. That is not detail. That is the whole substance of what Joe is claiming his case is. We need something about that, Joe, to have even a sense of what your reasoning amounts to, or like why you think this is convincing. We're just not told what the explanation is supposed to be. We're just supposed to sort of intuit that somehow God naturally accounts for this in a way that is satisfying and convincing or simple or whatever. That just isn't good enough. We need some reason given us and some, at least an outline, a glimpse, a something as to what the account is supposed to be.
Why? Well, because I had all these barriers to theism. I had the problem of evil and various other difficulties and arguments against theism that pulled on my mind, and those still just seem so strong to me. But then, in my second year of grad school, I started coming across overwhelming evidence.
Okay, so let's summarize at this point. So far, Joe has found a bunch of arguments for theism that he finds convincing, mostly philosophical in nature. Well, it's like appealing to certain science, maybe like fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony. But at this point, he still finds many objections to theism, like suffering, for example. And let's just actually go over what some of those objections were.
Oh, I still didn't go all the way to theism. Why? Well, because I had all these barriers to theism. I had the problem of evil and various other difficulties and arguments against theism that pulled on my mind, and those still just seem so strong to me. But then...
No, he doesn't say. I thought he did. Maybe he says later what some of those other objections were. But anyway, so we've got arguments of theism are persuasive, but he still has counters. So he's still an agnostic. So then let's see what the next step is.
In my second year of grad school, I started coming across overwhelming evidence for miraculous phenomena. I mean, it started with...
And this is where I really think the video went off the rails, because I was kind of expecting the philosophical side of it. Joe has argued in defense of some of these arguments before and seemed broadly amenable to that style of reasoning and argumentation. So I thought, it's not that implausible. Maybe he becomes the sort of a theist or something. But this part, the miraculous phenomena part, was where I'm not even sure what to say. Well, let's play the video.
Certain people making videos about like Our Lady of Zaytun, this apparition atop a Coptic Orthodox church that literally like hundreds of thousands of people saw, in addition to tons of medically documented healing miracles associated with it. Another thing that kickstarted my journey here was that my friend Cameron Bertuzzi was interviewing a bunch of different like professional psychiatrists and deliverance ministers and exorcists and various other people who are on the periphery of...
Did you hear the word he said there? Let me jump. I can't. Let me just jump back. Sorry, that's too far.
A bunch of different like professional psychiatrists and deliverance ministers and exorcists and various other...
Exorcists. So I reviewed a bunch of... I've done quite a few videos from Cameron covering exorcism and exorcists. I don't know if Joe's watched any of my coverage. I suspect that he hasn't. But like, Joe is actually, in his official conversion video to Catholicism, citing, amongst other things, of course, Cameron Bertuzzi's exorcism videos as one contributing factor to his conversion. Is this serious? Like, that is... We're taking that serious. Like, again, I mean, I took it seriously to the extent that I spent time going through those claims and talking about it, right? It's interesting to discuss why people report these things. It's part of the human experience. So in that sense, it should be taken seriously. But like, really, we think that these exorcism claims are providing... They're just an absolute joke. If you're interested, look at some of the videos I've done in the past. But the quality of the evidence is just unbelievably bad. It's just people report... Excuse me. It's just people saying stuff, essentially. Now, Joe does have he does cite other examples that allegedly, many of which I haven't looked into, which allegedly have documentary medical evidence and things. But I'm just focusing on this here because he mentioned it, right? He didn't have to mention this. Evidently, that was the exorcism videos, or at least part of the reason, were a contributing factor. I just find that utterly baffling. Like, how is any skeptical person taking these exorcism accounts seriously? Like Cameron Bertuzzi's video specifically, I was shocked when I heard him say that. Oh, that's not what I want to click on.
People who are on the periphery of deliverance ministry concerning demonic phenomena and manifestations that they've witnessed with their own eyes. And like here we're talking about like super recent, in totally perceptually conducive circumstances with sane people, sometimes in the context of like multiple or even dozens of witnesses, and like things that it seems like it's really hard to be mistaken about, and which are like these, complex multimodal experiences where like, the temperature of the room would just like instantaneously drop to freezing such that the person can literally see their breath and then become scorching hot such that everyone in the room just starts like sweating and testifying to.
So the temperature dropped to freezing and then went back up to scorching. And do you really believe that happened, Joe? Like, this is my rhetorical question. Do you really think that in whatever, I don't know what he's talking about here, like what the specific case is, this is where we're getting the slopologetics, right? Just a deluge of stuff. Do I expect him to go into full details about each case? No, but there's different ways to do this. You can highlight that this is a summary, or you can focus on one or two examples, or you can at least like name the person involved. Like you can do something. You can do better than this. Let me put it that way. This is where the slop comes out. It's just a claim after claim after claim with no details at all. Although he does have a bunch of links in the discussion, although it's sort of hard necessarily to link those to specific things that he's talking about. But I don't think he links to everything that he discusses. Anyway, but that's not the point. Links in the discussion is not the same as putting it in the video. But coming back to the temperature point, like, does Joe really think that actually happened? Or maybe it was just like someone said that it happened. He's presenting it as if it's a fact, whereas, of course, this is the whole question, right? Did the temperature really just drop and then go up suddenly? And here's another question that we should, Dov Rob, thanks for the dono. Oops. Got to go right now, but just want to thank you for dissecting this and supporting you, responding to your future videos. Yes, thanks very much. It's going to take a lot of time to go through all of these cases. But anyway, we'll get to that, but I appreciate the support. So what was I saying? Yes, remember that we're being told that these things happened without even trying to give us the means to look into that. But even aside from that, let's assume that the temperature really did go down and then come up again in the way that Joe describes. What does that have to do with theism or Catholicism? Is this expected under Catholicism? Is this something that Catholicism explains, sudden temperature fluctuations? Joe, help me out here. Like, what's the reasoning behind that? Now, I'm sure Joe could probably tell me something if I was talking to him. But if you're going to put it in your video, give some framework for why this is evidence for theism or Catholicism. He's just dumping stuff out that I guess he found compelling. But this is just lazy. This is not skeptical. This is not critical thinking. You don't just dump a bunch of stuff out and then, well, I don't even know, and then convert to Catholicism. That's kind of what we're getting here. I want to keep emphasizing that I'm not expecting him to go through the detail of all of these claims in a 25-minute video, but what I expect is to appropriately frame his changing thoughts in a way that allows us to see his critical thinking and working through the arguments, and allows then us to then look at it potentially later. So like, okay, here's this case that I found out about, it gives a name. And without going into details, I found that certain aspects of the claim were well evidenced, and I looked into a bunch of naturalistic explanations and I couldn't find anything convincing, whereas I think that the Catholic explanation of X, Y, and Z provides a unified explanation of this phenomena. Here's, you can look for more details if you're, I don't know, like that's just an example, but like dumping it out there without any evident skepticism at all just highlights to me that this is not a serious, like critical investigation of these phenomena. But anyway, let's keep going because we got a lot more of
things like, like a few days ago, I literally saw with my own eyes and multiple people present also saw it. And they told me afterwards where like multiple things were just flying across the room of their own accord.
Again, he states this as if they're happening, right? Multiple things were just flying across the room of their own accord. Did that really happen, Joe? Of their own accord? That is not a statement of fact. Like you can't just observe that something flew across the room of its own accord. You may say an eyewitness saw something flying across the room, which could not be accounted for by any action there that anyone performed or something like that. Like there's a difference between interpretation of the facts and the facts themselves. And this is a very common thing that apologists do, not just apologists, like paranormal advocates and others as well. They mix in Ethan Muse did this as well, constantly in my discussion with him. He mixes in interpretation with facts, and then you have to unpick, okay, what exactly is the verifiable fact that we have, and then how can we assess the explanations for that? I'm not seeing any attempt to do that, not only just in this video, but the way Joe is describing this does not give me confidence that he ever did this. Because the way he's describing it is he's just throwing claims out there, mixing interpretation with fact, and applying no skeptical thought at all, or not evincing any, and not telling us that he did any, which is really concerning to me. Another donor came in here. Thanks very much, Isaac of Nineveh. Cool name. We will discuss about Joe's concerns with this, eternal conscious torment and such, because I have some thoughts about that. I'm sure he will tell us more, but I think that's another notable omission. We will come to that. So yeah, the concern here is that there's a profound lack of skepticism in the way that he's presenting this, and it's coming across as just like a deluge of claims mixed with interpretation that just isn't really helpful for anyone.
And various other like instantaneous supernatural changes in facial structure or eyes or various other things like levitation and so on.
Instantaneous supernatural change in facial structure and eyes. What are you talking about, Joe? Like, this just sounds like crazy talk. I'm sorry, but like, does that not, what he's saying sounds absurd and ridiculous. Now, maybe he did find a specific case compelling that he's talking about, but don't present it like this. Like, we're being told about crazy supernatural changes in someone's face. Like, it just sounds like nonsense. And there's no way for us to check any of this, and no way to know what he's even talking about. And he's mixing up an interpretation because he called it a supernatural change. Well, that's an interpretation of the fact. That's not an actual fact. Supernatural is a claim about its cause. So again, there's a way to do this that mentions maybe a few specific examples and why you found them compelling and why you think that a Catholic explanation is superior to an alternate explanation. But we're just getting a deluge of slop, which is why I say that this is evidence that Joe was not proceeding in a skeptical way when he was analyzing this evidence, at least as far as I can see from what he gives us in this video.
I didn't actually believe these things for the longest time. I thought it was actually pretty implausible. But Cameron...
Yeah, it is implausible. So why is he explaining it now as if he does believe? Like, that's a bit confusing to me. I would like a bit more explanation as to what is the difference between thinking it was implausible then and now, because I don't really think he comes back to this. He then starts talking about other cases. But like, why would the other cases that he's about to talk about, why would that make these things more likely? Because they're separate divine actions. There seems to be a lack of an attempt to... Remember, the whole point is that theism is supposed to provide a unifying explanation for these things. But why is a supernatural change in someone's facial structure, how does that help to explain the temperature going up and down? These are just entirely different things. Why would you expect God to do one because he's done the other? That's not clear to me at all. These are just unrelated actions. So is there an attempt here to tell us why theism or Catholicism specifically accounts for these things? It just seems to be an assemblage of nonsense claims. That's not any reason to believe anything in particular.
Just kept pushing me. He was like, Joe, watch the video. What's your explanation of this person's testimony? You know, I'd like give these flailing, kind of implausible, naturalistic explanations.
Oh, this is super interesting. Let me jump back a second. So he's talking about Cameron here.
Natural changes in facial structure or eyes or various other things like levitation and so on. And I didn't actually believe these things for the longest time. I thought it was actually pretty implausible. But Cameron just kept pushing me. He was like, Joe, watch the video. What's your explanation of this person's testimony? You know, I'd like give these flailing, kind of implausible, naturalistic explanations concerning which I have no independent evidence. And basically I'm like having to divine from the armchair that these people are just like lying straight to their teeth. And then also like all the other deliverance ministers are in on it, and these various psychiatrists are in on it. And then like...
All right, so what's Joe's problem here? Because this appears to be his skeptical process in response to these miracle claims. Does someone want to tell me what the problem is? Someone's already mentioned this before in chat. Just a bunch of gibberish. Okay, someone's leading to this. Why is lying the only option? So the problem is that Joe has told us that he is, in response to Cameron's request to explain the testimony, Joe is attempting to divine from the armchair whether these people are lying and who was in on it and so forth. Joe, that is not how you investigate a claim like this. I mean, you can start with hypotheses, but you don't just divine it all from the armchair. You actually need to go and research, look into the specifics of the claims, what was documented, who claimed what, when it was documented. You need to look into the psychological, the sociological evidence, and look whether anthropologists have talked about this, or skeptical researchers, people like James Randi, professional magicians, whether they can replicate some of these feats, or there's a wide range of resources you have to investigate strange, unusual, paranormal, miracle type claims in the academic literature and in the broader space. But Joe's strategy is apparently not to do any of that, and it's just to try to divine from the armchair that people must have been lying. That is not a skeptical approach, right? But you might disagree with me about the best explanation for a certain phenomena, but you don't resolve these issues by just thinking about it in the armchair. And then if you can't think of a good explanation, then accepting the other person's explanation, what kind of approach is that? That's a terrible strategy for trying to arrive at the truth and for trying to work out what the best explanation is. Just if you can't think of it from the armchair in whatever amount of time, then, well, there mustn't be a natural explanation. Like, what is this? You need to actually do the research. And that's why this stuff takes a long time, because it actually, even for someone like me, who's like pretty familiar with stuff and has a pretty extensive education in a wide range of fields, it takes a long time to really do this work and track down the claims and put the pieces together. You can't just do it from the armchair in a few minutes. That's one of the reasons why this approach to apologetics is, I think, quite dangerous, because it's so easy to throw out these claims where you just paint this rich story about, you know, some supernatural event happening, mixing claim with interpretation of the claim and with your own opinion about, or like your own theory about what happened. And it takes so much longer to actually dig through the details and find out what the facts were that are actually evidence, separate that from the later interpretations, and then look into potential explanations for that, and then assess those explanations against those being provided by the claimants. That's a lot of work. If you don't want to do that work, that's okay. I'm not saying everyone has to, but I think the appropriate response is to then withhold judgment and not just think, well, from the armchair, can I think of an explanation that's satisfying to me and or Cameron? No, well, then Cameron must be onto something. That is not a good epistemic process. That is not a skeptical procedure to take. So I was shocked when I heard this. I was like, Joe, that's not how you do this. That's not how you investigate these sorts of claims.
Also, you know, like the government reports that we have to some of these phenomena are also like that the people who testified in those are just mistaken, and then like dozens of other. I was starting to shift in my seat. I was starting to become uncomfortable, and that was just like the first of my worries, because over the course of my second and third year of grad school, I was just utterly inundated with overwhelming evidence for miraculous phenomena. And like the caliber of evidence that we're talking about here is not like, oh, I prayed and my headache got better.
Utterly inundated with overwhelming evidence for supernatural phenomena. So that's a very strong claim. Utterly inundated with overwhelming evidence. I mean, what does one say to that? Like, the fact that there's a large number of claims is not really neither here nor there. It's very easy to have a large quantity of low quality evidence. But of course, he says that they're overwhelming claims. Well, based on what? Like, why is it so convincing? Joe hasn't actually told us why these cases are convincing. Well, he sort of did. And the reason he gave was because sitting in the armchair for an unspecified amount of time, he couldn't come up with good counter explanations. Joe, is that a good reason for thinking that there's no good explanation? Or even if there is no good explanation, is the absence of a good explanation a good reason to think that theism is a good explanation or Catholicism? Surely Joe is smart enough to realize the answer to that is no. You need to give an account as to why it is that these claims are evidence for Catholicism/theism, and not merely unexplained phenomena that presumably there is going to be some quantity of under naturalism, under theism for that matter. You don't expect everything to be explained, especially given all of the foibles of human psychology and memory and things like that, and also the reasons people have to potentially be misleading or exaggerate what happened, or motivated reasoning, things like this. So the fact that there's some things we can't explain is not really good reason for anything. You need an account as to why these things are actually good evidence to support Catholicism or theism or whatever they're supposed to support. But Joe hasn't even hinted at that. It's basically like, well, if this bunch of stuff really happened, then theism true or Catholicism true? It's a little unclear. And he never attempts to even draw that together. Again, I want to keep emphasizing that I'm not expecting all the details in this video. What I expect is the broad outline of the case. And it just isn't there. There's no outline. There's a bunch of slop. And then somehow Catholicism.
It's like, okay, Susie, like, I'm glad your headache got better, but I'm not quite sure that's a miracle. Instead, we're talking videos, photographs, blinded laboratory analyses, x-rays.
There's photographs and blinded laboratory analyses, guys. Call the science police. Joe, you know that you can have a blinded, there's plenty of blinded, there is rigorous blinded evidence of ESP. Now, I don't know if Joe believes in that, but the point is that there are many methodological issues that have to be overcome in order to demonstrate these sorts of phenomena. And just because that's just because the study is blinded doesn't mean that all of these other issues are overcome. There's a lot of interesting methodological questions here, and this is one of the criticisms that I have with apologists, that they just have no quality control or like evidential control standards, and this is where I think being a philosopher is maybe a bit of a problem, or at least if you don't have a good grounding in science. And to be honest, even a lot of scientists aren't that great at this. Maybe I'm just fussy, but like you need to understand the methodology of a given discipline and how you can distinguish between a claim that's well evidenced and a claim that's poorly evidenced, and a claim that's not evidenced at all. The fact that something is blinded is one piece of the puzzle. And note that just because the authors claim that it was blinded does not actually mean that it was blinded. You need to provide evidence of blinding. But again, that's just one piece of many that needs to be added to the picture. Throwing at us that there's like video evidence and x-rays and blinding as if this is sort of just painting the menagerie of just how good this evidence is not a skeptical thing to do. It's not careful. Pick one example and give a couple of illustrative aspects of why it's convincing, and then say, link in the description for more details. That's a way to do this, right? That doesn't take a long time. There's other ways to do that as well. Talk about general processes that you went through and not specific details. I'm not asking for a 5-hour video here. I guess that's coming. What I'm saying is there should be evidence of a framework and skeptical process and good methodology applied to assess these claims. There is no evidence of that Joe is providing in this video. He's just throwing out buzzwords that, there's photographs and x-rays and then blinded studies. But what is even the claim, and what does that have to do with anything? What about the other methodological aspects? Apologists and other promoters of these sorts of claims just never ever do this. Or if they do, it's sloppily done and inconsistently done. And that's why these sorts of claims don't get published. I should say rarely, because sometimes they slip through. They very rarely get published in quality journals, and inevitably when they do, then they are retracted, or that there's substantial criticism of them, because none of these sorts of findings can be replicated, or the analysis can't be replicated, or that there's just insufficient evidence to establish what happened one way or the other, and it depends on the specific claim that's being made. But this is the point. The methodology is just incredibly sloppy. And I think I want to then highlight another point that I mentioned before. Remember I talked about Joe's use of the word "you can imagine"? He mentioned that twice in his discussion about the philosophical arguments. And then he kind of mentioned it again when he was talking about armchair thinking about the responses to Cameron's miracles. That's more or less the same as imagining, right? This, I think, is one of Joe's major problems. Perhaps it's the major problem. He seems to rely way too much on his own imagination and thought experiments and abstract considerations, and spend way too little time looking at actual empirical evidence and scientific approaches to resolving questions. I think that you can see that in the examples that I've highlighted, in that he relies just on what makes sense to him without a careful examination of, well, from a philosophical point of view, like evaluating the different explanatory merits, because we didn't really get that framework at all in the philosophical side of it. And then in the case of the empirical side of it, we didn't really get any sense that there's any kind of empirical or like scientific or skeptical process here. It's just like, what is compelling to me or compelling to him? So that's what I think is the fundamental problem here, that Joe appears to lack a empirically grounded skeptical process for evaluating claims and assessing the evidence for and against a claim, and relies overly on his own intuition or personal judgments or thought experiments or whatever the process. I mean, he hasn't really told us yet. Whatever that is. And to be honest, I think there are quite a few philosophers who fall into this trap. And that's a broader criticism I have of philosophy. They try to armchair too many things. Not to say that all philosophers do this, but I think it is a problem. So that is, if I were to diagnose the core issue here that I have with what Joe is saying, that's the issue here. There's too much reliance on intuition or armchair judgments, and not any evidence for a clear process for evaluating claims and comparing explanatory merits of different theories, whether that's philosophical or empirical, but especially on the empirical side.
You name it, we got it. It's like we got blinded laboratory
analysis.
What
do you mean you name it, we got it? Like, come on, that's a slogan. That's not actual. That's just, he didn't have to put that in the video, but that's the way he just, anyway.
He's saying, yeah, this is suffering myocardial tissue. And what's that doing in a host that a Catholic priest just prayed over? Like, if you see that, what am I supposed to?
So now we've got appeals to Eucharistic miracles. I have not investigated these sorts of claims, so I can't say any specifics here, but like, really? Eucharistic miracles, we're going with that? This doesn't even make sense to me. I mean, I need to look into this, but I thought the whole point of Catholic doctrine, someone can correct me here if I'm wrong, the whole point of Catholic doctrine about transubstantiation was that the host is not supposed to have the like superficial properties, like the physical properties of of flesh. Like it's supposed to still look like bread or a wafer or whatever it is, but there's some sort of its underlying substance is changed or something. I mean, I don't know what that means, but like, how is then it expected that there's myocardial tissue there? Like, I don't understand how that's even consistent with Catholic doctrine. I need to look into that, but that's just bizarre to me. But anyway, putting that aside, like, yeah, Joe, like, I don't know how myocardial tissue could have been found in the host. That sounds pretty weird to me. That's something that we want to investigate. But he's just throwing that out there as if that's just like a fact that, I don't know. It just sounds crazy talking about these sorts of things. I think most Catholics don't even believe that. Like, what? Why are we being asked to buy this? This is the quality of the evidence that we're being given.
To do? What am I supposed to do when you see that? It's like, oh no.
Good question, Joe. What are you supposed to do when you see claims of that sort? Myocardial tissue in the host. Here's what I would suggest you should do. The first thing you should do is try to track down as best you can what the primary source for this claim is. Whether it's documentation or eyewitness, if there's lab reports or whatever it is, track that down as best you can. And then the second thing you do is look for methodological issues in terms of, like, in this case, it would be how the sample was collected, how it was processed, who analyzed it. Check for each step in the process as best you can, and then compare that to methodological good best practice in the relevant discipline there. So those would be the first two things you do. The third thing you do is then see what other people have said about this. Look at other people who've attempted to explain this. Look at potential alternate explanations. And the fourth thing to do then would be weigh that up together in accordance with who has the best explanation. So what's the Catholic explanation for this? I don't even know that all Catholics accept Eucharistic miracles of this sort, or like this specific one. But see what they have to say. What's their explanation of it? Is this expected under Catholic doctrine? I don't think it is. But maybe it is, and you can give an account for that. And then what's the alternate explanation given the first few steps? So that seems to be what you should do. So track down primary evidence, evaluate the quality of that evidence in line with methodological practices in the relevant disciplines, seek out countervailing evidences or arguments and explanations, and then weigh them all together against the Catholic explanation and evaluate their explanatory merits. That's what I would outline the broad process should be. Is that what Joe did? Well, if it is, he doesn't give us any clear evidence that he did that because, well, he just throws these claims at us without any apparent critical evaluation or telling us that there was a critical evaluation. You know, I'm not expecting to go through all the details here. I feel like I have to keep repeating that because people are going to misconstrue what I'm saying. If I'd convert to Catholicism and was providing this sort of evidence, what I would do is highlight the process and then maybe give one or two examples and then say, we'll talk about the details in a future video, but this is the sorts of things that convinced me and this is the process that I followed. And here's why I changed my mind on this specific point, right? Or like, here's the general things that I changed my mind about and the process that I followed. Here's where I got to where I am. But we're just not getting that. We're just getting a deluge of slop and no evidence from my perspective of critical evaluation of that. And that's why I'm very upset, because my whole thing is about promoting critical thinking, scientific knowledge, carefully evaluating claims and thinking about things rigorously. And I'm just not seeing any evidence for that here.
If it's on these healing miracles, it's like we got documentation to like complete, instantaneous, permanent remission of advanced multiple sclerosis in combination with an uncollapsed lung, redefinition of calf muscles, an instantaneous removal of blindness at the same time. Oh, all in connection, by the way, with like a complex hallucination. Oh, and I know actually like a religious experience of like a booming voice saying, "Get up, my child, and walk." Like that's the level of evidence that we're talking about. And for some,
yeah, so there's quite a lot of miracle, healing claims that have been made. I've looked at some of those that have been presented in the past. When looking through the documentation, I've never found them compelling. But again, you have to take each case on its merits, and it takes hours to look through these. And I'm sure there's things I miss because I have background in biology and so forth, but I'm not a medical doctor. So ideally, you want to then talk to people who actually have specific expertise there. That takes even more time if you do that. It takes so much longer, I should say, to investigate these claims critically and to follow that process than it does to just spout out these things with evincing no critical evidence. That's why I call this slopologetics, because this is what it's like. You just make a whole bunch of claims and then invite someone to reflect in the armchair. Can you explain this? Well, without looking into it further, no, I can't, right? Well, it must be evidence of Catholicism or something. And again, we're not given any reason to think that this is evidence for Catholicism. Why is this specific healing claim evidence for Catholicism, or even theism in general, or Christianity, whatever it's supposed to be evidence for? What about all the people who pray for miracles, healing, and don't have that happen? Or well, if God's in the business of helping people like this, why didn't he prevent the accident or disease in the first place? Isn't that what you'd expect an all-loving God to do? You need further excuses and ad hoc hypotheses to even get this to work as an explanation. again, I don't expect all the details here, but I'd like some acknowledgement of this and some sort of structure for evaluating that. Okay, so we've got a bunch of miracle claims on the one hand, but then on the other hand, there's these facts that many people don't have healing experiences, and there's all these other things that happen in the world that seem contrary to the idea that God wants to heal us. And so, how do we evaluate that in totality? That there's just sort of no acknowledgement that that's even a thing that one would want to do when evaluating this evidence. And why does God heal some people but not others? It seems kind of ad hoc. And then, the naturalist, of course, is going to say, well, look, there's a lot that we don't understand about the human body. There'll be some residue of cases where it's hard to make sense of, and we don't exactly know what happened. But we expect that. We don't expect everything to be explained. That would be ridiculous. And particularly what we would expect is that the people would interpret those unexplained cases or unusual cases in line with their religious or spiritual worldviews, and then they would tell that story and repeat it in those ways, which would then lead to memory biases and then potentially the accounts becoming more impressive over time, and so details might slip and so forth. So, even if you can't explain the specifics, the naturalist is going to have a story to tell about why we have these claims. And so then we need to evaluate the two different worldviews and see how well they do in accounting for these sorts of cases. I think that the evidence for miracle claims is pitiful, even if we can't explain every case. The ones I've looked into, I think you can often give plausible hypotheses about what happened. Spontaneous remission and incorrect initial diagnosis are two common ones, but that's not going to be every case. Or if there's not medical documentation, then memory contamination effects is common. Sometimes there is medical documentation, but again, you have to ask, who documented this and what procedure do they follow? And why should we can't assume that just because something was documented by a doctor, that means it's correct, right? That there's a lot of medical mistakes. And so there's all these things that happen that must go into that consideration. But the point is there that from what I've looked at, even if we can't explain the particular case, the evidence is just really underwhelming. This is God's way of revealing his miraculous healing powers to the world. There's so many things that he could heal that would be so much more obvious and could be documented in a rigorous way, but it just doesn't happen. It's just like these residual cases that we can't quite account for, and often for symptoms that are subjective in various ways or variable. Now, maybe that's not the case in a specific instance, but you have to take each case on its merits. But I don't find these cases really compelling at all. And of course, different people will evaluate them differently. But what I'd like to hear is why Joe finds them so convincing, and what process he went through to critically evaluate these. And we're just not told any of that here. So I find that very disappointing.
The canonization healing miracles for which medical documentation is required. It's like we got pictures of the dude beforehand with his severe...
Yeah, but those canonization healing miracles, so the process of the Catholic Church there is to, yes, they do require medical documentation, but their process is just to rule out, it's a process of exclusion. They rule out any natural explanation. And then I think there's a few other requirements as well, but basically then they can declare it to be a miracle. But that's a terrible process. That's not how the scientific process works. You don't just rule out a bunch of explanations and then whatever's left, it wins by default. You actually need evidence for that explanation. It needs to actually have explanatory merits on its own ground. Unless you can prove, mathematically, that something is demonstrably false. Mathematical proofs can work this way. You can do a proof by proof by contradiction is a little bit different, but you can do proof by cases where you rule out these different cases. But the thing is that in empirical science, you can almost never rule out something definitively. It's all just a question of how likely is this. So that's why this exclusion process is not a sound methodology, at least for the vast majority of cases. Because let's say that there's three explanations, A, B, and C. Let's say that you show that A is a 1 in a million. You won't normally be able to put a number on it. I'm just illustrating for the sake of argument. B is 1 in 10 million. So you conclude, well, that's a very implausible explanation. So we're going to go with C. So that's just demonstrably fallacious because you haven't evaluated how likely C is. And so what we do generally is then you try to assess the plausibility and explanatory merit of each claim with each explanation of the evidence, and then evaluate them against each other. Doing it by exclusion gives an advantage to the one that you treat last, because if the initial things are sufficiently unlikely, however you set that threshold, then that's going to win by default. That's just an unsound scientific methodology, unless you have essentially a deductive process where you can prove with certainty that the initial things are impossible. And that's just not the case for at least the vast majority of empirical research. And even, yeah, anyway, so I don't think that's a good methodology. So appealing to Catholic canonization process is not something that I find very convincing. Now, the documentation, well, that needs to be looked at case by case. But the fact that something is medically documented doesn't mean that we just should accept the claims that people are making on the basis of that documentation. That's, again, evincing a lack of skeptical analysis.
bilateral congenital clubfoot. We have pictures from his childhood where you can see them, and he's like, we have testimonies from all like his friends and whatnot, and his teachers, like to the effect that he'd always have to like walk on the sides of his ankles and whatnot. And we've got pictures of him throughout childhood with that. Oh, and then he prays to one of these Catholic saints, and then afterwards, both of his legs are straight and completely healed. It's like, okay, this is insane. Oh, and it's like we've got X-rays afterwards and pictures afterwards. Okay, what's going on here? And then
I don't know, Joe. I haven't heard of that case, so I don't know what's going on. Is there anything that we could think of that might be going on there? Well, we could speculate. We could do some armchair theorizing, but that's not going to resolve the question. We need to actually go and look at the evidence. You follow the procedure that I talked about. So Joe's not actually arguing for anything here. He's just sort of throwing out examples and then, oh, what's going on here? This is not what a skeptical person does. And, this is not just some video where he's riffing on this point. This is supposed to be his conversion video, like telling us why he converted in broad strokes. And this is the quality of the analysis that we're getting. It's pitiful.
Just go through all these other cases, and it's just insane, and I just can't believe the conspiracy that I would have to posit in order to explain them all away.
All right, there we go. The conspiracy that he would have to posit. Joe, why are we reverting to conspiracies? I mean, sometimes conspiracies are the right explanation, but in general, I would say they're not. Depends on the case, but I just don't understand where conspiracies comes from. Why are we reverting to conspiracies? I think that there is a failure in the reasoning process going on here if we think that, well, it's conspiracies and lying, or it's, I don't know, Catholic miracles, I guess. He generally hasn't told us that at this point, but I'm trying to read through the lines here because he's not giving us even the barest bones of what the case is supposed to be. Like, here are the claims, here are the competing explanations. Here's why I think that this supports Catholic miracle, like the Catholic doctrine or whatever. We're not actually told that. He's just throwing a bunch of stuff at us and then saying, well, I can't explain this without really implausible conspiracies. So yeah, wow. What is that? That's that might be convincing to Joe. It's not convincing to me. I don't think it should be convincing to anyone. And importantly, this is not how you go about thinking critically. And we need more critical thinking in today's world. We need to show people how to reason about things, how to think carefully, how to evaluate evidence. And I'd like to think that Joe would agree with that. And those are good, important epistemic virtues. I'm not asking that he puts all of that into one 25-minute video. I'm asking that he showcases the process and encourages people through his example that those things are important. But we're getting the opposite of that here. He's throwing a bunch of like sensationalist slop at us and with no process or skeptical thinking applied to it at all. Even if he did have skeptical process, he's not showing us that. And that's what I'm really critical of here. That this is why this is a bad video. I can't tell you what his process was. I can only tell you what's in this video. That's what I'm critiquing here. And this video invites people who might be sympathetic to Joe, theists, or maybe other people who are thinking about considering theism. If they look up to Joe, it invites them to consider this to be a process to emulate. But it's not. This is a horrible process. This isn't how you find out what's true and what's not. That you hear a bunch of sensationalist claims and then armchair speculate what the explanation could be. And if conspiracy doesn't work, then you just give up. What is that? That's not skeptical. That's not critical. That's not a good thinking process. I think Joe is just doing a very bad job at exemplifying good thinking here, which is why I'm upset, because that's my whole thing. I really want to encourage people to think critically and carefully and work through claims. And we're seeing the opposite of that here from someone that people look up to.
It just seems like the universe was conspiring to make it look like God exists, God is performing certain miracles, and not just miracles, but miracles that seem to vindicate distinctive Catholic doctrines.
Okay, so we get a little bit more on that, because this is an important point that I've said, that we need a reason to link these anomalous claims to Catholicism specifically. I don't think he does that for any of the previous claims, but he does do that with some of the subsequent ones, which we'll get into, like more specific, well, Eucharistic miracles are Catholic miracles, but I'm not sure how that specific example follows from Catholic doctrine, given what I know about what they say. The point is, though, look, Joe, we've got a bunch of slop that we had here that doesn't seem to clearly vindicate any Catholic doctrine. Why don't we delete that from the video and focus a bit more time on just one or two of the examples that do, in Joe's mind, more clearly support Catholic doctrine, because those seem to be like kind of evidentially relevant in a way that the early ones, it's much less clear that they're evidentially relevant. So again, this is an issue here. Like, if we're to say that some of the claims specifically support Catholic doctrine, because the previous ones, it's not clear that they did, then, well, those are the ones that matter. So let's focus on those. But let's transition to that. Then he starts talking about more specifically like Catholic miracle claims.
You've got, for instance, very well evidenced Eucharistic miracles. You've got extremely well evidenced Marian apparitions like Fatima and Lourdes and Zaytun, where like Mary is like granting requests for conversion to Catholicism. She's saying, get the Holy Father to consecrate Russia, outside of his jurisdiction, by the way, to my Immaculate Heart, thereby vindicating the Immaculate Conception, which only Catholics dogmatize. And of course, she's like, as I said.
Oh, sorry. I think he's talking about Fatima there, because I know that that was one of the claims made, that Mary was talking about Russia and concerned about the conversion of Russia, because this happened just after the or even kind of during the Russian Revolution, I guess, 1917. So this is a case that I have read a bit more about. So again, without going into all the details here, this is an interesting case, because what we have is claims that these children observed the Virgin Mary appearing to them on a number of occasions. There were witnesses of the children, or the children talking to someone, but no one in the crowd saw the Virgin Mary. So that's a little weird. I don't know if that's expected. It doesn't seem expected to me, but I guess you can come up with something. But look, here's the concern, right? So if Catholicism is true, I think the idea here is something like this. If Catholicism is true, then the Pope, Catholic Church generally, has a sort of legitimate ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the whole world, including Russia, which, like normally is under the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church. I think that's what Joe is talking about here. So the idea would be that this claim appears to vindicate, like it is speaking from a perspective of someone who thinks that the Catholic Church has legitimate jurisdiction over Russia, as opposed to Orthodox Church or whatever else. Okay, so what's the explanation here? The explanation is that in order to support that claim that God is making about this jurisdiction, God sends Mary to appear to 3 children in rural Portugal a few times and talk about the need to convert Russia, and no one else saw them. But then there was some weird miracle that happened with the sky and the sun moving around or something a bit later on, and that's how God chose to make it clear to the world that the Pope has jurisdiction over Russia, because he chose these 3 shepherd children with quite an intense religious upbringing, by the way, in rural Portugal. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me. That is not what I would expect the divine, omnipotent ruler of the universe to do. Now, maybe you could say, look, James, how would you know what God would do? You can't read his mind. Well, no, I can't. But the thing is that if I can't, then who can? What's the basis for claiming that we would know that God would or would not do a certain miracle? And then that kind of undermines the whole process, which is we're supposed to be able to recognize God's action. When I see a case like this, I see vulnerable children who are put in a difficult situation and were falsely bound up in a combination of psychological and sociological factors that led them to believe that they had encounters with the Virgin Mary. And I see this as kind of evidence of the exploitative and predatory practices of the Catholic Church in terms of like the upbringing that they had and how strict it was and things like this. I've talked about this more in a previous video. I think it's unethical for a deity to put such pressure on such young children like that, particularly children who weren't even literate and obviously didn't have a lot of knowledge about the world and ability to deal with this. So I think that that's a strong argument against these being divine revelation. Now, lots of factors to consider here, right? I'm not going to say that settles the case. But the problem is that Joe is just throwing these things out at us as if there's somehow clear evidence of Catholicism. But it's by no means clear to me that they're evidence of that at all, even if you accept like the appearances, like that maybe some supernatural agent did appear to the children of Fatima. That doesn't mean that it's God, right? There's all sorts of further explanations you could have there. There's just a real lack of a framework here for understanding how Joe thinks about these evidences and how he evaluates the evidence collectively to then make a judgment as to what the most reasonable inference is. And again, suppose you think that Mary appeared to children in Fatima. That doesn't mean that Mary also appeared to people at Lourdes or Zaytun. I mean, these are different appearances with different histories around them and different details. In Zaytun, in particular, it was many people, thousands of people who allegedly saw Mary herself over a period of time. I haven't done as much research into that. But whereas in Fatima, it was only the children who saw Mary, and later they saw the son. These are very different ways that Mary presented herself. Why the difference? And why would you what's the connection between 1917 Portugal and like 1960s Egypt? seems a bit random. There doesn't seem to be any clear logic as to why one miracle is explained. Or let me rephrase that. There seems to be no unifying explanation as to how one can account for both miracles under the same framework. It seems like you just need to postulate that God wanted to do both of those miracles, and he just did them in that way because he just decided to. Remember, the idea is that you need to account for the intention to do a specific action and then the means by which God did that action. So evidently the purpose of the Marian apparitions in Portugal and in Fatima was to vindicate a number of Catholic doctrines, including like jurisdiction over Russia or something like that. So why is God in the business of doing that? Because there's all sorts of other things that he doesn't vindicate specifically through miracles, at least not in the present day. Maybe you say Jesus was, but and then why did he choose these shepherd children in Portugal to do that? It's a weird way to do it, God, like a bit strange. And why couldn't other people see Mary? But in Zaytun in 1960s Egypt, I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to vindicate. But even if we think that maybe it's ministry to the Muslims or something like that. I don't know. But like, since when is God in the business of doing that? And why is he doing it in this way with like these sort of unclear apparitions of the Virgin Mary, I think appearing over like a church or something in Egypt? It's just a weird way to go about that. Is that really something that is well accounted for under Catholicism? What it seems to be is just an assemblage of ad hoc claims that don't really fit with each other at all, other than a general connection to Catholicism in some vague way. And we're just sort of being slapped a label onto that as, oh, this is a miracle. This supports Catholicism. There's no actual framework. There's no explanation. And that's what I was highlighting before at the start of the video. We need an explanation to be provided so that Catholicism provides a better account for these claims than does naturalism or whatever other worldview you might like. But again, we're not even getting the hints of that. We're not even being walked through any attempt to systematize the thinking about that. We're just being thrown examples, and then it's sort of asserted that they just support Catholicism without any attempt to ground that in a process or in with a like in an explanatory framework. So this is what I find objectionable here. So just having a quick look at chat. Appreciate everyone's comments. It's a bit hard for me to follow whether people are talking to me or other people in chat, but
granting petitions to convert people to Catholicism. She's like telling people to pray the rosary. So she's like advancing the cause of praying the rosary, which of course meditates on mysteries like the Assumption and the coronation of Mary. Oh, and of course it's Mary herself, the Mother of God, appearing to people. It's like it's just shot through with Catholic vindicatory implications. And there are all sorts of reasons why naturalistic explanations aren't good and why demonic explanations aren't good. And that's just Fatima. Like in Lourdes, we've got Mary telling Saint Bernadette Soubirous.
Okay, so that was all about Fatima. I wasn't clear about that. Yeah, so he doesn't really tell us what's wrong with naturalistic explanations or demonic explanations or what other religious traditions might think of this. I mean, what Protestants, for example, might think about Fatima. But again, here's the thing. Suppose there is no convincing naturalistic explanation of any of these phenomena. Interestingly, he didn't mention miracle of the sun. It was just the appearances, which was only to the children. But anyway, suppose that we don't have any convincing explanation. Does that mean that we should accept the Catholic explanation? Is that a good explanation? Well, we're not really told. We're told it's vindicatory of Catholicism because it had Catholic elements, but that doesn't really seem to be distinguishing between the competing explanations here. Because of course, if we think it's some sort of combination of, or if we think it's psychological and sociological in nature, of course it's going to have Catholic elements in it. That's the product of its environment. I always say this to Christians or apologists, and they never seem to get the point. Look, a Catholic miracle in a deeply Catholic country is much less convincing than a similar Catholic miracle in a Buddhist or Muslim country. Now, Zaytun is kind of that, although there is a large Christian community in Egypt as well, so that's not exactly the same. But the point is, if something occurs in a historical context where it's part of the beliefs of the people, or it's reasonably can be accounted for in terms of the beliefs and practices of the people at the time, that is actually evidence in favor of the fact that it originated from those beliefs and practices. And that's why God seems to have a very strange practice, from my point of view, of trying to demonstrate his omnipotence by putting miracles in historical contexts where they are entirely comprehensible from naturalistic perspectives. Why not do a Fatima in like 13th century China? There was some Christianity. There was a bit of Nestorian Christianity, I think, around that time, but like not Catholicism at that time, or even put it in Japan, where I don't think they had any Christianity at that time. And, if that's documented, that's way more convincing than if it occurs in 1917 Portugal. It's like one of the most Catholic places there is, right? Especially in a poorly educated rural community. Not that, miracles only happen in those contexts, but these people and children seem to be particularly vulnerable to that. It's like God deliberately puts miracles in places where they're most explicable. with like children or poorly educated or people who have who are in vulnerable situations for various means, or people who are like seekers or whatever. Not 100%, but it's disproportionate. I actually talked about this in my Fatima video if you're interested, like the statistics of Marian apparitions. It's mostly children and Catholic priests who see Marian apparitions, which is very interesting. But anyway, God has a weird habit of doing that. And to me, that mitigates very strongly against these being supernatural. It doesn't prove that, but I think that you've got to evaluate these things comparatively. And Joe is just not showing that sort of critical evaluation or comparison, which is frustrating because this is the whole point. If you were to say that God did this as a divine vindicatory miracle of some claim or some doctrine, then that comes with it a bunch of predictions or assumptions about God's activity. Like God evidently adopted a particular end, but then he used a very strange and ineffectual way to achieve that end, like putting Catholic miracles in the context of children in deeply Catholic countries. But that's not very convincing. It'd be much more convincing if you put it in different contexts. Put it in the context of highly educated people from different thought traditions, like in Buddhist or Muslim countries, or maybe even like deeply Protestant context. Like that would be more convincing than a deeply Catholic context. But we're just not seeing that level of critical analysis, which is very frustrating to me. Because that's the whole point. We should be comparing worldviews and seeing what they account for, and not just saying that Catholic elements somehow just automatically vindicate Catholic doctrines. Having elements of something doesn't vindicate something. The question is, what is expected under the two competing explanations? Are Catholic elements expected under a naturalistic explanation? Of course they are, right? It's a Catholic context. Are Catholic elements expected under a theistic explanation? Well, presumably, yes, right? So that does not distinguish between the explanations. It doesn't even distinguish between demonic explanations, because presumably demons would also introduce Catholic elements, say, in order to falsely vindicate Catholicism because they want to lead people down the wrong path, or whatever you think demons do. I don't know. So this is another failure that I see commonly in religious apologists, and it's unfortunate from my point of view to see Joe demonstrating that, is a confusion between details that are consistent with an account or a theory and details that are evidence for that account. If a detail is equally well explained by two competing explanations, then it's not evidence for either one. Now, of course, in practice, it's not always going to be equally well, like identically well explained. But the point is, to take this example, Catholic elements are expected under all of the explanations. And so it's not really clear at all that they're evidence for any of the explanations. We need to look at something else and try to find elements that are less or more expected on one explanation than another. I think appearing to children is not the sort of thing that an omnibenevolent God would do. I think that's exploitative of the children, who are not in a position to properly understand with what they're dealing with or deal with all that pressure. If a human adult put children in this situation, would probably have criticisms of this, just like we criticize people who put a lot of pressure on like child actors and singers and things like this, and potential exploitation of them, even if it's for a good cause. It's like, well, the child is not really in a position to be able to consent to this or properly understand it or deal with all of the resulting pressure. So I think I have a real issue with that. And, so that's potentially an issue that distinguishes. So maybe there's other issues which mitigate in favor of the Catholic explanation. Of course, I'm open to that. But what we need to see is this distinction being made between what's consistent with or coherent in an explanation and what's evidence for that explanation. This is a fairly basic point, but it's a very common mistake that's made by apologists and people who are not carefully evaluating something. I think that Joe is making that here, at least, again, in this video.
Like, je suis l'Immaculée Conception, or however it is, like, parlez-vous français, oui or non? And you want the baguette, the croissant? Anyway, she's literally saying to St. Bernadette.
I'm not sure if this is in response to what I'm saying, Isaac, or you're talking to someone else in chat. It's a bit hard to say, but I'm not sure what Ethan's got to do with it. I'm talking about Joe's video, not what Ethan has said. I'm saying that Joe has not made the point that there are specific elements that are more expected under Catholicism than another worldview. Joe is not even actually saying that an entity worked well. Like, Ethan talks about the miracle of the sun a lot. Joe hasn't mentioned that, so I'm not assuming that that's what he's referring to. He's talking about the apparition, and all we have there is the children interacting with someone who no one else could see. So is the fact that there were Catholic claims made evidence for the truth of Catholicism? I don't see how it is, because that's expected under any explanation. That's the point I'm making there. I don't accept that, Isaac. I'm responding to what Joe has said. I'm not responding to what people who talk to Joe have said. That I don't understand how I can possibly. if that's the case, then nothing Joe has said has any relevance, because one could just say, oh, but someone else has talked about things, so I need to then respond to every book that he's referring to. No. I'm responding to the case that he's presenting in this video, not what other people have said to him about things that may have informed what he's saying. That's a completely unreasonable expectation, that I could somehow respond to like every version of an argument that Joe is mentioning that may have influenced what he's talking about. No, I'm responding to this video and the case that he is presenting here. There was another point here I saw. Captain Christianity has a video with Schmid post-conversion. Oh, really? Already? With a tier list of best arguments for God coming out. Oh, no, you're saying it's coming out in a few days. Yeah, that could be quite good, actually. I mean, I think we probably know what his tier list is going to be, but yeah, it could be interesting. We'll have a look at that. Let's keep going.
I am the Immaculate Conception. I mean, how much clearer could you possibly get? And then God just goes out of his way to perform like the most unprecedented string of like concentrated, medically documented healing miracles in all of history at Lourdes. Just insane. Or, you know, if I want to be French, Lourdes. Oh, and God's also.
Yeah, so I don't know the specifics of that, so I won't talk more about that case. I think the general point that I've highlighted before is is going to fall here. Yeah, I understand that, Isaac. I'm not talking about the specifics there. I don't think it's reasonable to say that because Ethan has argued certain things, that therefore I should just impute that to what Joe is saying. I'm talking about the case that Joe is making here. And what he's not doing, I think, is linking specific elements to as being evidential for a specific worldview over another. Catholic elements are expected in either case. Now, if you want to say that the fact that, like, it's not even clear what the miracle at Fatima was. At Lourdes, he's talked about miracle. Sorry. At Lourdes, Joe has highlighted miraculous healings as evidently the miracle element. I don't know about that. I won't comment about that there, although I have broad concerns that you might imagine based on what I've previously said. But at Fatima, Joe didn't mention the miracle of the sun at all. He just talked about the Virgin Mary appearing to the three children. I don't know what the miraculous element's even supposed to be there that's supposed to be vindicatory. But even if there is a miraculous element, it's not clear whether that is vindicatory of Catholicism merely because it has Catholic elements, because a demonic explanation, even if you buy the miracle, would still seem to predict that. Now, Joe's told us that he doesn't think that that's good, but he hasn't even, like, he didn't tell us anything about what elements distinguish those explanations, or even highlight that as being an important component. So again, there's a better way to do this that highlights the process and the key points, whilst then deferring a detailed discussion of each element, to a further video. So I'm suggesting that what we're being shown here is just a gushing forth of stuff, which is not a good way to show how you changed thought processes in a way, like belief systems, in a way that shows the thought process and like critical thinking and reasoning skills, which is what I'm primarily concerned about. So I'm being critical of that because of the way he's presenting this here. And so I want to emphasize again that it's not lack of detail. It's the way that he's presenting the case and what he's not telling us, and what he's not emphasizing, that I think it would be is important here. If you think that details distinguish worldviews, you should highlight those. And like the lack of consideration for Catholic details being something that doesn't distinguish them, I think is an issue here.
Going like out of his way on multiple occasions, on multiple different continents, and in multiple different centuries. He's going out of his way to like make sure that when like a Catholic priest, it only seems to be Catholic priest. When a Catholic priest prays over.
Yeah, so see, this is interesting here. It only seems to be Catholic priests. I mean, there's plenty of miracle claims made by Protestants, and look, in all religious traditions. So I don't know what his basis for that claim is, that it's only Catholic priests. Maybe those are the only ones he's looked at, but maybe not. I don't know. But he only talks about those. But anyway, the point is, if it was only if it's only Catholics who see the Virgin Mary, to give another example, because miracle, like healing claims happen in all religious traditions, so I don't even know why he's saying that. If only Catholics see the Virgin Mary, to me that's evidence against Catholicism, right? Or at least it's against those those miracles being vindicative of Catholicism, for the reason that I just said, because it seems to fit better with the explanation that those are psychological and sociological in origin rather than divine in origin, because divine intervention or divine miracles are not. There's no reason for them to be, or no obvious reason to me for them to be, no clear reason that I've heard for those to be geographically isolated in that way. So when he's saying here it's only Catholic priests, so that might speak to some aspect of Catholic practice, perhaps the fact that they have an official process for investigating miracles and documenting them, for example, which most other traditions don't. Or a certain expectation for certain types of miracles. Eucharistic miracles would be an example. Not necessarily. I'm not saying that's a knockdown. What I'm saying is that there seems to be a clear lack of insight here, that isolation of or concentration of claims to within a particular tradition does not necessarily vindicate that tradition. In fact, it may mitigate in the opposite way, you have to focus on not just whether an explanation is coherent within a tradition, but whether there's evidence that distinguishes the different explanations. And this is another example, I think, it only happens to Catholic priests, which is not highlighting that, which is not showing us that that's been acknowledged or that that's been seriously considered.
Person Brett turns, oh my goodness, there's suffering myocardial tissue afterwards. And like we've got like scientific documentation of this and like blinded laboratories and like blinded scientists who look at these things. And we also have the pictures of them that we can compare. And you can even ask AI to look at the pictures. And it's like, oh yeah, it seems like musculoskeletal or some kind of like muscular tissue. It's like,
Yeah, again, don't know details here, so I'm not going to talk about details. But it's not clear what process he followed, Joe followed to evaluate these claims. He's just sort of talking about it as if it's established. Of course, the simplest explanation for there being like laboratory evidence of myocardial tissue is that it is myocardial tissue. The question is, where did it come from? So that's less clear to me. I mean, you need to check the provenance of a sample and establish it as not being contamination. That would be my obvious concern. And again, we'll have to look into the details here, but it's just the way this is being presented, I find highly problematic because we're not getting any sense of the skeptical process here. We're getting things thrown at us.
and of course, the miracle at hand simulates like precisely the ontological change that Catholics believe in. And there are so many other things that I'm leaving out.
Wait, hang on.
Finally, a skeletal or some kind of like muscular tissue. It's like, And of course, the miracle at hand simulates like precisely the ontological change that Catholics believe in. And
I feel like Joe should know more about this than me, but I don't get this claim. Can someone explain this? I thought I said this before, I'll just repeat it. I thought the whole point of transubstantiation was that it still looks like and has like the physical properties, there's a term they use. It still looks like in all superficial ways, the host, like the wafer, but it has as its like substance is part of the body of Christ. I don't understand how the idea that you look at it under a microscope or whatever and you see myocardial tissue, how that is consistent with the Catholic doctrine. It seems to me that it's inconsistent with it. I don't know. That's just not how I'd understood the Catholic doctrine to be. Because if it is the Catholic claim that the host, like that the wafer actually transforms into myocardial tissue, then that's easily testable. And that, I haven't done this, but I presume in the vast majority of cases that is not what happens. So why does it happen sometimes when that there's already issues here that immediately arise, which again, I'm not asking Joe to resolve all those issues here, but when he raises an issue and then just throws it at us as if it's just, oh, well, the fact that there's tissue there vindicates Catholic teaching. It's not even obvious if you accept the claim on the face value that Catholic teaching does explain that. So again, that there's a lack of a process here for establishing what different competing explanations have to say about, or like how well they account for given facts, and we're just getting details thrown at us with no analysis of that. Again, even at a summary level. Yeah, actually, that's an interesting point. I hadn't made that connection. Remember, the claims are evidence dispute between Joe Schmid and Mart. Not sure who Mart is, but I do remember this. This issue coming up. I can't remember. I think there were a number of people involved in that a few years ago. Yeah, because Joe just seems to be taking a lot of claims at face value here, which is one of the primary problems with, one of the primary pitfalls with this sort of evidence is not doing the due diligence of critically evaluating those claims. But anyway, interesting. Interesting here. So the Catholic Church holds that the appearance of Christ's body is hidden as in the appearance of the bread, but God could also give the appearance of real human flesh. Well, it could, but couldn't you do that for anything? I don't know. It's not obvious to me that this is a sort of expected thing by Catholic theology, but I suppose we could argue about that. But this is one of my points. Is this expected under Catholic theology? Let's continue.
There are so many other things that I'm leaving out, but finally, in February of this year, I sit down with Ethan Muse for 4 hours to talk about the overwhelming evidence behind St. Padre Pio's mystical charisms.
I knew people would say this. This irritates me. Oh, just on that point. I'm not saying Catholic theology rules it out, but is it well explained by Catholic theology? It's less clear to me. But anyway, the point was that it's not discussed. Okay, this is what irritates me here. It's strange to judge a person by a short video with a story conversion when he's preparing a long video justifying change in his position. Well, what's the point of this video then, if I'm not supposed to judge the claims that he makes in this video? If this is all somehow beyond criticism, then why bother watching it? I don't understand what we're just supposed to just listen and then not engage our critical thinking skills. I'm not complaining that he doesn't go into enough detail about these things. Look, I've spent an hour and a half explaining what my problem is. The problem is that there's a profound lack of critical engagement across the board, from at the level of analyzing how you assess different competing explanations of what happened to those previous objections that he had, that Joe had about like animal suffering, which he just never comes back to, which is a huge omission. And then all of the claims that he's throwing at us without any sort of coherent account as to how he skeptically engaged with this. This is what you want from a video like this. At least that's what I want, I should say. I want to see the process and the thinking and the structure of the change, and what the key elements are and how they fit together, and how that is ideally logical and rational, at least from their point of view. And I can see, okay, I can see how they put that together. What I don't want is just a dump of miracle claims with no evidence of skeptical engagement at all. So am I supposed to not be critical of that just because there's a longer video coming out? That's like if someone writes an article when they summarize their position, the article is bad. The defense is, well, I wrote a book going into more detail. That's not a defense of the article. The article could be bad. Maybe the article could still be bad, even though the book's good. I really find this objectionable because there's always a longer version that you just have to go to get like the good version. Okay, so maybe this wasn't good, but you can't criticize it because there's a longer version. No, I can criticize this all I want based on its merits in what it does in the time that it uses, and that's what I'm trying to do here.
We have doctors who issue reports like immediately afterwards where they're like, yeah, I literally, and they're describing in like tremendous detail their observations. Like, yeah, he literally palpated his hands and his feet. And like, he's like describing like, yeah, I felt a palpable void in between his hands and it was separated by thin membranes on both sides. Oh, and another doctor on an earlier occasion was like, yeah, I examined it and there was.
Oh, I'm getting triggered here. Oh, no, that's sorry, not the one I meant to mention. This one. He's not saying, Joe is not saying that miracles are prima facie a conclusive defense. Well, I didn't say conclusive. Are they evidence for it? He's describing his process of conversion. So are we supposed to conclude that this is a non-rational process then? I mean, if so, then I would still have the same objections because his channel name is Majesty of Reason, and these are supposed to be evidences in some form. What I'm saying is that the process that he's presenting of how he evaluated this is incredibly sloppy, and I expect better. I don't expect all the details filled in, but I expect well, I've explained what I expect. So if we're then to be told, well, this is just his story, right? It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be well-grounded. It doesn't have to have a good process. It doesn't have to show skeptical engagement. Well, I just disagree. I think it should, especially, given the context of his channel. And he talks about the more personal aspects of it later as well, which is a little different. So no, I am going to judge this based on what it does with the time that it has. And I'm not going to accept as sufficient the idea that, well, there's a longer version coming out, so you should just not criticize anything that he says. Well, then why did he put this video out if he doesn't want people to like engage with what he's saying?
Like a complete hole going through his entire hand, such that I could literally read things on the other side of the hand if I put his hand up against it. So it's like, okay, what's going on? Oh, and then he has these for like 5 decades long with a bunch of other people seeing them. We have pictures of them. We have videos of them. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people saw these over the course of those 50 years. Oh, and then like we've got pictures on the day of his death where he has no scars despite having deep wounds for 5 decades. And of course, like the etiology and the character of these wounds is just totally incompatible with various naturalistic explanations that you might proffer. And then that's just the stigmata. And it's like we've got so many medically documented healing miracles with him involving like the regeneration of.
Yeah, so he links to some, again, I haven't looked into the details of this particular case. I think that I've already made my point about this, so we'll just continue.
And also like this odor of sanctity. So like where he goes, like it would come in like waves, this like massive, beautiful fragrance that would like fill rooms and that would like stay with some of his relics for like years on end. Oh, and also like dozens of times doctors are taking his temperature and it's like giving naturalistically inexplicable readings. So like on one of the occasions, the doctor has a mercury thermometer, takes his temperature under his armpit with a mercury thermometer. It literally shatters. So then they get a professional bath thermometer and then take his temperature with it. And then it reads 125 degrees. I mean, it's just all your organs would just utterly fail at that.
I'm not saying it's irrational. All I'm saying is he's stating the reasons for his conversions, not making a profound defense of the reasons. Well, I think that is what he's doing. He is stating his reasons, and I think he's stating them in a way that illustrates a sloppy process of skeptical engagement. And that's the whole thesis of my video. So yeah, I think I'm justified in making that claim.
Point. I could go on, and there are lots of reasons why all these have like Catholic distinctive vindicatory implications, where like it seems like God is going out of his way to put his stamp of approval on distinctive Catholic doctrines. My broader point is that over the course of my second and third year of grad school, I just start getting inundated with evidence for miracles, firstly, but also miracles that seem to vindicate distinctively Catholic doctrines. And not just that, but just as theism offered just this like wonderfully unifying explanation.
Now here's one of the reasons I focus on this, because he talks about this as well. Theism offers, well, let you hear it in his words.
Distinctively Catholic doctrines. And not just that, but just as theism offered just this like wonderfully unifying explanation of like a vast and diverse array of otherwise pretty striking and coincidental data, I started to see Catholicism in the same light. It started to seem to me that Catholicism just unifyingly explains all this miraculous evidence, the pattern of miracles, the individual miracles, and it also would make it not particularly surprising that I might be going systematically astray with respect to some of my moral intuitions or some of my intuitions.
I'm not sure why he talks about the moral aspects here. I mean, whatever. But so he's telling us here that he thinks Catholicism, he started to see how Catholicism offers a unifying explanation for all of this stuff that he just threw at us. But we're not given even a hint as to what that might be. We've heard about the miracle of Fatima. We've heard about Zaitun, Lourdes. We've heard about Eucharistic miracles. The guy with the stigmata, I forget his name. What else was there? He mentioned demons briefly, that the temperature change. Remember, there was that thing. Healing miracles as well. What do any of these things have to do with each other? I'm not saying that they're ruled out by Catholic theology, but this is the confusion between something being consistent with an explanation and something being evidence for that explanation or that worldview. Because these things seem to me to all require, at least potentially require, separate postulates about the way that God interacts with the world and what his intentions and purposes are. So I'm just not, even on the surface, I'm not seeing any unified explanation. What I would like is for Joe to give it the barest hint of what unifying explanation is supposed to be, because it seems that it's a bunch of ad hoc claims that God does this and God does this and God does this in certain circumstances, but not in others. I'm just not even getting a sense of what that unifying explanation is supposed to be. But Joe has told us about this at the start and is mentioning it again here, that there is this unifying explanation, but I'm just not seeing what it is. And I think that's a weakness in the video, that he doesn't even try to draw out what that's supposed to be. I guess it's just like, well, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a important gap in the video that we're not helped along to see what his thought process was in seeing how this is what the unifying explanation is.
Against hell or various other things like that. So I started to see Catholicism in much the same way that I saw theism. Of course, I still had lots of objections to Catholicism. It was so hard to get through all of them, like I had objections to hell.
Oh, sorry. Right, yeah, I guess, yeah, we'll get to that. I want to comment on that at the end. Oh. Yeah, I'm not saying that he needs to answer every question in this video, but I think that the structure given here and what he decided to do is very underwhelming given his channel, his history, and the importance of this video.
Objections
but I'm hoping he'll make this more rigorous in his upcoming video, so we will be reviewing that.
The Bible, and I had objections to the moral teachings of the church, and I had magisterial objections and whatnot. But just over the course of, those 2 or so years, I just started looking into the objections further, and they just started to wane. So in addition to reading theology and philosophy and magisteriology, in addition to all of that, I watched lots of YouTube videos, but also I would just sit down for hours on end with my good friend Ethan Muse, and we would just go back and forth on these various.
All right, so I'm going to make the same criticism I made before. So I understand that Joe is telling us his conversion story, so that's fine. But it's also fine for me to critique that conversion story and tell you aspects that I think are wanting and highlight problems with this process. So what's the problem with this process? Let's have a look at what he just said. I think this is in partial response to all of the miracle claims and other things that we just heard about, plus the arguments for God's existence. And then what does he do with that?
And they just started to wane. So in addition to reading theology and philosophy and magisteriology, in addition to all of that, I watched lots of YouTube videos.
So he reads theology, philosophy. To be honest, I don't know what magisteriology is. Something to do with the Catholic Church, I presume. And he watched YouTube videos, and then.
But also, I would just sit down for hours on end with my good friend Ethan Muse.
And he talked with Ethan Muse. Okay, so what's missing from this picture here? So I think that it's important, yes, to read philosophy and theology. That matters. That's a part of the puzzle. But we also need an understanding of how the natural world works. If we're supposed to be, Joe was evidently once a naturalist. We want to understand the natural world. That's an important piece of, the vast majority of worldviews pictures. And in particular, if we're to make claims about what's possible biologically through healing, or what people can claim to have seen or experienced in an apparition or something like that, I'm just trying to think of his other. What might happen in cases of alleged demonic possession. There's a lot of empirical evidence that from biology and psychology and sociology and anthropology, as well as history, that is relevant to those issues. And Joe makes no mention of engaging with any of that. you might say, well, he's just not saying that he did. Well, but that's a major omission, right? That's the point. If he did engage with that extensively, then he should tell us here, because that's an important part of the process. If he didn't, and that's why he's not mentioning it, then that's a real problem. If you're just reading theology, philosophy, probably a lot of philosophy of religion, I'm guessing, based on what he said, watching YouTube videos, well, that seems to be a lot of capturing Christianity, like Cameron's videos, many of which are terrible and I've critiqued before, and then talking to Ethan Muse, this is going to give a very one-sided perspective on all of these things. It's good to engage with both sides or multiple sides and see what each has to say and look holistically at the evidence presented to us. And I'm really just seeing evidence here for a quite limited engagement with scientific, critical, skeptical, atheistic thought about all of these things. I'm not saying he hasn't engaged with that at all. Obviously, he's had people on this channel, but this is how he is presenting his story. He is talking about his response to these miracle claims as being talking to Ethan Muse, watching YouTube videos, evidently a lot of Cameron, I don't know what else, and then reading philosophy and theology. We're missing a lot there that we need to properly evaluate these claims. So I'm really critical of the process that's gone on here, and there seems to be a lack of skeptical evaluation and a unwarranted narrowing of the sort of fields we're engaging with to evaluate these questions. I'm just having a quick look at chat here. Let's continue.
And we would just go back and forth on these various objections. And for the most part, he was just like systematically coming out on top. So I was like, oh man, what's going on here? No, but like, and his responses to my objections were actually quite powerful.
Yeah, I'm really shocked that he mentioned the demon stuff. I know that he mentioned a lot of other things as well, but he still mentioned it. It was part of the, I can't get over that. Oh, well. Sorry, jump back a sec.
Yeah, what's going on here? No, but like, and his responses to my objections were actually quite powerful. I mean, ultimately, it was the 4-hour conversation with Ethan Muse on Padre Pio that convinced me intellectually that Catholicism is true. I just said to myself, like, listen.
This is just really disappointing to hear. How can a 4-hour conversation about this particular person how can a 4-hour conversation with Ethan Muse convince you? I mean, I know it's on the background of this stuff, but like, that just shouldn't be how you evaluate claims. Like one conversation with a singular person. Ethan Muse's whole point is to argue for miracle claims that vindicate Catholicism. That's fine. You know, I defend naturalism. Ethan defends Catholicism. Everyone people defend their own worldviews. I don't have an issue with that. What I have an issue with is people who his channel's name is Majesty of Reason, and who, you know, is held by many people to be a role model of like good thinking and balance and things like that, evidently just makes his mind up definitively about Catholicism on the basis with a conversation with one person whose whole point is to argue for the, divine origin of this particular, Catholicism and similar miracle claims. Why is Joe then not going away and thinking about this and talking to other people who might have a skeptical take about this or who might interpret it in a different way? Maybe you'd say, well, he's done that previously about other things, but Joe is specifically telling us that this one conversation was quite definitive and important in flipping him over. And changing his view. And I think that just really speaks poorly of his reasoning process. One conversation with someone who is an apologist whose point is to push this specific message should not convince you of anything like this if you're a good thinker. Just as much as one conversation with like me about, say, the resurrection shouldn't convince someone who's already a Christian to just deconvert, right? They should also look into the evidences of what people have to say who might be critical of it. If Joe had already done that and already came with an armament of knowledge of all of the skeptical views, and this was the final straw, then he should have told us that, because that's not how he's presenting it. That's not what I'm hearing. And in particular, I'm not hearing any sense that there was a careful consideration of the best that there was to have to offer about different competing explanations from different worldviews and an equivalent level and intensity of engagement. He seems to... Joe talked about how he engaged extensively with Josh Rasmussen earlier on. Now he's talking about how he engages intensely with Cameron and Ethan. He hasn't mentioned anyone else who he engaged with as intensely, who might have a skeptical or an atheistic or even like a Protestant or a Jew or someone who is a theist but presumably doesn't accept these specific miracle claims. So if he did engage with that, it seems to be much more superficial and less significant and less... less engagement with less time spent, significantly so. And I think that's a real problem if we're to sort of evaluate this process. I think that it's a real, it really speaks poorly to the ability to sort of critically analyze these sorts of things. That's just not the sort of thing you should do. Convert to Catholicism after a 4-hour conversation with Ethan Muse about this stigmata guy, right? I forget his name. I haven't looked into it. I'll do a video on it. Don't worry. I'll do it. I'll look into the details later. But I just find that really hard to understand, to be honest. And I think that that's not how you should go about forming beliefs about these sorts of important issues.
I can't imagine, if I died right now and I saw Christ, I can't imagine having to tell him what I'd have to tell him by my lights as a non-Catholic. I was just not willing to bet my soul on just like, not only a single conspiracy, but just like a conspiracy of conspiracies that are just like conspiring to make it look as though Catholicism is true. And so the day after that call with Ethan Muse, I did my examination of conscience, covering a decade of my life away from the faith. And then the following day, I did my general confession. Praise God. Now, I've been giving you the intellectual side of the story, but any conversion... Praise God. Now, I've been giving you the intellectual side of the story, but any conversion...
So that's supposed to be the intellectual side of the story, and it culminates with a 4-hour conversation with Ethan Muse about a particular miracle case, which he doesn't mention in talking to any other people that length about that. I find that baffling. But anyway, let us consider what was not mentioned. Now, he's going to talk about the personal side of it. We might go through that quickly. I don't want to comment. Again, like, if someone has personal experiences and believes that Jesus spoke to them or something like that, they're entitled to their own interpretation of, their own experiences insofar as that goes. And if they want to then understand that as Jesus speaking to them, then I can offer a potential alternate explanation, but at the end of the day, that's up to them. But when someone is presenting an intellectual process as being an evaluation of evidence and claims, that's when I'm much more critical. And I'm going to highlight areas where I think that their thinking has gone awry or their process is deficient. So that's what I'm focusing on here, the supposed intellectual side of the journey, as Joe has just said himself. Now, what is missing from that intellectual journey? We've heard a bunch of arguments about God's existence. That was the first part. And then we've heard a deluge of miracle claims, I think evaluated very poorly. We've talked about that, which relate more specifically to Catholicism. But there's a really weird omission here, at least from my point of view. And again, maybe it was a part of the process, but we're just not told about it. I think that that's kind of a problem either way. And that is, we didn't hear anything about the Bible, the historicity of the Bible, the claims made in the Bible, the plausibility of those claims. We didn't hear anything about Jesus, his resurrection, the evidence for the reliability, nothing about that. Now, you would think that that is kind of something that would be an important part of converting to Catholicism when it makes a lot of claims about this, and that's sort of core, much more core to their claims than any of these miracle claims. The core miracle claim that Catholics talk about, like any other Christian, is the resurrection of Jesus. And we didn't hear a single thing about that. I think that's really weird that you convert to Catholicism and evidently at no point in your intellectual journey was it important for you to evaluate the claims about the Bible, Old and New Testaments, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's so bizarre. Like, that's not a minor point. That is the central issue. And that is nowhere to be found in the intellectual journey. I even did a debate with Jimmy Akin on Joe's channel 10 months ago about this, about the resurrection. And, I'm not saying that debate by itself should be definitive either way or whatever, but like, there's just no mention about it, about anything relating to that. I mean, surely it's not just me thinking that that's a very strange omission, that's like, that it just doesn't compute that you get from agnostic to Catholic without going through the point of, hey, what about the Bible and the resurrection and like, Jesus and all this stuff? Like, he does mention Jesus a little bit at the end in terms of like the personal side of it, but like not in the intellectual part at all. I just think that's not good enough. It's just not good enough for someone like Joe for him to not mention critically engaging with that in a video like this. Maybe it either goes two ways. Either he didn't do any extensive engagement with that. Well, that's a problem. Or he did, but he's just not mentioning it in his summary of his intellectual case. Well, that's not really good enough either, because if something's that important and you don't mention it, you don't highlight that as something that was relevant to you and that needs to be, that someone needs to investigate in evaluating, the core claims of Christianity, then I think that that's doing a disservice to anyone who might be watching it and takes this seriously, who treats this as something to aspire to, as many people do. Many people look up to Joe. So I don't think either way, it's not good enough. It's a major omission, and a huge problem with this video is he just doesn't say anything about that from an intellectual point of view. So let us then finish out a bit. I've got less to say about the final part.
Elements, it has.
Because just primarily I'm interested in the intellectual part. I'll finish it out because I wanted to allow him to play the whole video. I don't have as much to say about the personal part, but I might make a few comments here and there, and we'll finish up.
Personal elements, spiritual elements, right? Because conversion is not just a change of mind. Conversion is a change of heart. And so what helped me change my heart? I mean, ultimately it was God, right? But what changed? Well, it started with St. Mary Gretty. I watched this video produced by Gabby After Hours on the story of St. Mary Gretty. And long story short, she's this 11-year-old girl whose 20-year-old neighbor takes an impure liking to her. And one day, this 20-year-old neighbor, Andrew Serenelli, comes up to her and says, unless you do what I want you to do, I'm going to kill you. And he's got this long, sharp object that he's pointing at her. And she says, no, I'm going to remain pure. And so he stabs her, ultimately 14 times. On her deathbed the next day, she's rushed to the hospital. Somehow she survived this, even though he thought he had finished the job. On her deathbed, she's offering up all of her suffering for the salvation of souls. She's enduring it patiently, not complaining. And she also says, I forgive Andrew Serenelli, and I want him with me in paradise. Andrew Serenelli is caught. He's brought to prison, and he's just this ragingly hateful man. He's just blaming her. He's full of resentment. He's being violent with his other inmates and whatnot. But then one night, he has a dream. And in that dream, St. Mary Gretty appears to him and hands him, one by one, 14 white lilies, which he, of course, rightly interprets as her forgiving him for each of the 14 times he stabbed her. He wakes up a completely changed man. He calls in a priest. He confesses to having murdered St. Mary Gretty, and he radically transforms his life to the point that now there's a cause for his canonization. So when I reflected on this story, I was like, this is such a profound and beautiful story of radical forgiveness, radical love, radical purity. And it's listen, whatever she's on, I want some of that. And so this was one step.
I don't know anything about the story. I'll just take it at face value that all those things happened, although as a general rule, you should not. But, everyone will get different things out of stories like this. I'm generally a fan of forgiveness as a general principle. I find the story a bit gross, though, given the context of what we're talking about here. I probably should be careful the words I used because YouTube doesn't like that. But yeah, I don't know. I just find that weird to cite that as something that is so striking to Joe here. But that's subjective, so I don't want to say too much on that. But interesting that he chose to share that one.
Step along the path of kind of instilling within me a kind of magnetic pull, kind of magnetic attraction to Catholicism. The same thing happened with St. Maximilian Kolbe. And of course, I was already quite affected by the figure of Christ in the Gospels. He speaks with this authority. He's preaching radical love of neighbor, radical forgiveness, radical self-sacrifice. And that was already quite attractive to me. But the stories of some of these saints, and there are lots of others too, like St. David and Molokai, really influenced me. And then in addition to that, I had these quasi-religious experiences where I was just I'd just be sitting in gym and I would just feel almost in waves, just this sense, you could be a saint. You could be a saint. I didn't actually hear a voice in my head, but I knew that somehow was what's being communicated to me, right?
I find this very strange. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to say too much here because people will say I'm being too harsh. I think that's a weird thing to have as an impression given to you that you could be a saint. It feels like thinking a bit like delusions of grandeur kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe that's just the way God communicates to people, but yeah, it rubs me the wrong way. I found this a little bit disconcerting, but everyone experiences things differently. So I'm not going to claim too strongly of that, but he's sharing his experience for everyone to hear. That's my reaction to it. I find that weird and a strange inroad to Christianity about how you could be a saint. I mean, I don't exactly know what he means by that, to be honest. To me, what I find most compelling about Christ is his Jesus, I should probably say, his concern for the poor and the downtrodden in society, and that I find to be something worth emulating. The like radical forgiveness example that Joe gave is considerably less compelling to me. Anyway,
this palpable call to sainthood, and as I said, it almost like came waves. And at the same time, I was being convicted of my sin. I was just seeing the manifold ways in which I seriously fall short of how I'm supposed to live. And so God was here just launching like a full frontal assault on me to get me converted, right? Like he's just like putting all these like overwhelmingly beautiful and inspiring saint stories on my radar. He's making them have a significant impact on me. He's like giving me these like quasi-religious experiences to kind of calling me to sainthood. He's giving me this like weird, almost indescribable magnetic attraction to Catholicism. And his...
That's an interesting phrase. I didn't pick that up in the first reading. The strange quasi-magnetic attraction to Catholicism. I wonder what that attraction, because he didn't mention that in the video so far. What's the attraction exactly? I presume he's not talking about the intellectual side of it, because you wouldn't use the word attraction there. Like, what's so attractive about Catholicism? That would actually be very interesting to hear about. One of the things that I've always said is to like, what would convince me to become a Christian is an answer to the question, how would becoming a Christian, adopting that as my identity and leading that sort of life, how would that help me to become a better person? And I think that this sort of turning that into an argument is sort of the meager moral fruits of, religion or Christianity or specific forms of it, I think is a very powerful argument against the divine origin of these things. I think you need to make a whole bunch of assumptions about, the claim is that God changes you. And I don't know if Catholics claim this exact same thing. I mean, it is in the New Testament. Paul talks about this. Maybe they interpret it differently to Protestants. But like he changes you, and you're supposed to like not have a desire to sin anymore, and you die to sin, and then are reborn in Christ, kind of thing. That seems to make claims about the nature of how people would behave after conversion, which don't seem to be borne out empirically, and you need to make a bunch of ad hoc hypotheses about that, which I don't find convincing, and I just don't find it obvious that religious people are that much different to anyone else, Christian or otherwise, in terms of like, there's obviously, like socio-demographic differences, but in terms of like, are they better people? Well, there's some good ones and there's some bad ones, right? So like, what's the appeal? I personally don't see it, right? I'm not saying that means Joe can't see it. That's not my point. I'm just reacting to that, right? I don't see the appeal. What is it that's... Joe talked about his magnetic attraction to Catholicism. I've never found that, because in trying to engage with religious traditions since I left Mormonism. I've never found that level of attraction, even if there's certain elements in religious traditions I might like, this or that thing. But I just all found it to be a lot of words and a lot of symbols and a lot of practice, that like a lot of ceremony, that at the end of the day doesn't really make much of a difference in the vast majority of people's lives. And so I'm sort of like, what's the point exactly? Anyway, that's not supposed to be a rebuttal so much as a reflection in response to what he said there. So yeah, the point is that I would be genuinely interested to hear more about this magnetic attraction that he talks about, because that's not something I've felt. That would be interesting to hear about.
Frontal assault succeeded in changing my heart. At some point in every conversion, someone goes from that reaction that I said earlier, like, oh no, like there's so much evidence for Catholicism, like, oh my gosh, you look at the miracles and then you got this cognitive dissonance, you're like, oh no. At some point you go from that to like, oh man, this is so wonderful, this is so beautiful. You have a change of heart.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? But what's so beautiful? I don't think Joe's really told us that. I guess the forgiveness part, he didn't mention that. I guess he finds that beautiful. But what else is beautiful about Catholicism? I'm genuinely interested, because I'm interested in how people think about this and what they see and what I'm missing, kind of thing. Obviously, people, different religious traditions see things differently. But I mean, I would have enjoyed this video far more if he said nothing about the intellectual side of it and just talked about what he sees as beautiful in Catholicism. That would be, I think, a more interesting video, personally.
And so God effectuated that within me. And so it was the combination of the kind of head factors and the heart factors that ultimately culminated in that general confession. God is good. So good. Don't write off who you take to be even the hardest of sinners, because where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Now, I said at the beginning of the video that I've got some cool things to...
I want to call back to, remember he said that near the start of the video that one of his main reasons for losing his faith in Catholicism initially, when he was a teenager, was the suffering of animals. And I said that he doesn't come back to this. And you'll see that I am indeed correct. He never mentions this again. I'm not saying he hasn't thought about it since then, but That's a major omission for, I previously left Catholicism because I had this concern, to then never mention how this concern was resolved in even an outlined case. Again, this is why I think it's not a good video, because we're not drawn through the process and shown how, from Joe's point of view, it makes sense, evaluating, showing how he's thought about the arguments for and against in the critical process that I would expect of someone like Joe. So that's what I'm criticizing in the video. Not that all details are absent, but that the process just isn't there. There are major gaps, like this objection that was never responded to, like the fact that he seems to spend so much time talking to theists and Catholics and not other people, like that he doesn't mention anything about evidence for historical factors of Jesus in the Bible. Major omissions here, which just should be present in this sort of video from someone like Joe. And I think it perfectly justified in criticizing. And it'll be good if he does, I'm sure he will fill some of these gaps to some extent later on, but from the respect of what he's talked about so far, I think that it's fair to say that that's a weakness of this video. Oh, I like this quote. It seems that God is entirely absent from the squalor of our life. Yeah, that's the sense that I get. I mean, I like the way of putting it. And it doesn't seem to make that much difference of whether you're religious or not. That's why I find these miracle claims so unconvincing. Even if we can't explain the specifics, it's like, but there's so many other people suffering that God doesn't do anything about, even if they prayed for it and so forth, and no matter how faithful they are. So like, I just don't really understand how the ones that come through are evidence for Catholicism or whatever other tradition, but then the ones that don't are not evidence against. It seems like that we need some way to think about that, and they sort of not acknowledging, like, what Joe didn't do is show how he thought through all of the considerations for and against and came out in the position that he does. What he did is throw a bunch of stuff at us, almost like a salesman, and just sort of leaving us with the impression that there's just so much great stuff that somehow, but in not a very clear way, convinced him that Catholicism was true. I have a real objection to that, because it's not showing the skeptical, thoughtful process, which is what I want to see. The name of his channel is Majesty of Reason, but where's the reason here? I didn't see that shown in the video.
Share. So one of those is a new channel intro. So let's get into that.
Oh, yeah, this is interesting. I'm just going to reduce the speed so we don't have the music distorted here. Hopefully this isn't copyrighted.
Wow. Isn't that so cool? I don't know. I love it.
I mean, he can look, Joe, that's his new channel intro, apparently. Joe can have whatever channel intro he likes. I find that personally way over the top and overly pompous. But, to each his own.
My friend Juan put it together. Thank you, Juan. Everyone say, thank you, Juan. And then there are a few other very cool things coming up. So on Monday, my in-person interview with Matt Fradd is coming out. And then throughout the rest of next week, there are lots of other...
Yeah, like, I mean, is that partially a troll? Apparently he's going to be putting that at the start of his videos. I don't know. Like, I don't know. It's weird. I think that's a really weird thing to put in there.
Mysterious in-person interviews that are going to come out that I'm not going to talk about right now. You're just going to have to find out what those are about and who they're with. Here are some plans for the channel going forward. I'm still planning to occasionally produce general philosophy content. There will be a major change, though. So
he's talking about here how this channel is going to mostly just turn into an apologist channel for Catholicism, which I think is interesting because it was never that before. It was never an apologetic, like, well, you wouldn't use that word, I suppose. But the channel was never about a defense of naturalism or even agnosticism. It was, he brought different people on and evaluated different arguments and things like that. It was never that polemic. At least that wasn't the sense that I got. I didn't watch a lot of his videos. I watched some of them. I was, on one of the debates that we did. But like, I just think this is a weird turn. I would expect that he would show his new worldview. That's fine. But there's a difference between, I am a philosophy channel who talks about a lot of philosophy of religion and broader philosophy, and now I'm going to be doing that from a Catholic point of view, to I'm now pivoting hard towards becoming a apologist Catholic channel, which is apparently what he's going to be doing here. I don't think we need more of that. I think we've got plenty of particularly Catholic apologetics on YouTube. Obviously, Joe can do whatever he wants with his channel. I'm just expressing the fact that I find this disappointing. It would be, I think, more interesting from my point of view to essentially keep the channel, but just, have his own worldview then manifested in the content that he does, as opposed to like pivoting hard towards Catholic apologetics. You can infer what you will about why he might be doing this.
The major shift is that I'm planning to focus on arguing for Catholicism and theism going forward. I'll be going through everything I went through in this video in much more depth. It will take a lot of time, but I want to essentially create and compile together the best series of videos in history on arguments for God's existence and Catholicism. I can't promise it, but I'd like to do it. So first, I'd like to start with arguments for theism, then systematically respond to arguments for atheism, then comb through the miraculous case for Catholicism, comb through the non-miraculous arguments for Catholicism, respond extensively to all the objections to Catholicism issuing from atheists and generic theists and Protestants and Orthodox, etc. I want to develop an extensive body of videos criticizing other religions. Like, again, this is all just like a dream of mine. I'd like to do that, and we will see where the Lord takes me.
Oh, that's something else I forgot to mention. So this is the first time in the video that any other religion other than Christianity has been mentioned. He doesn't appear to have spent any time thinking about, well, even other forms of Christianity, let alone Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism. Even if, well, Buddhism's maybe a little different, but even if you're a theist, it would seem reasonable to try to evaluate a different range of worldviews and look at what they have to say and their perspectives on things. But I mean, I've highlighted before that seems to be a major gap in his process here. But now he's going to be arguing against those worldviews, even though there's sort of no evidence that he was interested in engaging with them prior to converting to Catholicism. Not that that's very uncommon. That seems to be the norm, that people basically just go with the worldview that they're brought up with, or at least that they're socialized into, maybe when they're older. It's pretty rare that people convert to something that's highly outside of that. It does happen, but it's unusual. By the way, I don't think that is what you would expect if God was really trying his best to communicate his divine plans to us, that there would be such a cultural bias in the distribution of believers. But anyway, that's another view. I just find that disappointing, essentially, that something that he's not done before, like he hasn't said much about other religions at all, and the first mention of them is that he's going to be giving a comprehensive rebuttal to them in his new Catholic apologetics channel. I just find that a bit frustrating from the point of view of what I value about discourse and reasoning and things like that. Of course, he can do with what it likes with his channel. I'm just saying, I think it's a bit it's disappointing, a bit sad.
Debates and discussions will be continuing, and I also just ask for patience. Things are getting very busy, and I also ask for your prayers. Know that I will be praying for you.
Okay, this is sort of irrelevant, but why is he filming the screen of his laptop here? Why doesn't he just share screen in the, I don't know. I just find that weird. Rosemary, though, there. Rosemary Breed's there, though. I notice. Not so subtle. Spiritual Light. I wonder what that book is.
And also, stay tuned very soon for my many hours long comprehensive case for Catholicism. I think you're really going to enjoy it. That's going to be on my channel. So definitely, of course, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and give me thousands of dollars in Patreon, of course. Hey, our time together has unfortunately come to an end.
I have an issue there with asking people to give him thousands of dollars in Patreon. I don't mind people mentioning how to contribute to them if they like, but look, there's an issue here, right? There's a clear issue here. He is converting to Catholicism. This is his announcement video for that. That's going to attract a lot of attention and particularly sympathy from a particular audience. And then he throws in at the end, oh, give me thousands of dollars on Patreon. He could do that if he wants. I have an issue with that in terms of the sort of image that it gives is still, what the motivation for this is. Now, people are going to misconstrue me here. I'm not saying that he's not sincere. I just find that to be objectionable, the way that he presented that in the context of everything that came before it. He made a kind of a joke of it, oh, give me thousands of dollars. There's a real issue here about people making content online, arguing for a religious point of view, and specifically asking for people to donate to them to support that work. I mean, Capturing Christianity has been criticized for this, I think rightly, the way that he's pursued that as an example. So this is an issue that I think should be dealt with sensitively. So the way that he flippantly put that in there in the context here, personally not the best look. I think that needs to be dealt with a bit more care. It's a bit crass, I think, the way that he did that. Again, asking for donations in principle, I'm not saying that's wrong, but that was, I think, not a good way to do that in this context here. I I think we're done here.
That's my conversion story. It's ultimately a love story. And I hope it's the beginning of a similar love story on your end. Praise God.
All right, there we go. So that's my thoughts on that conversion video. So let me summarize a couple of points here and we'll end up here. So I didn't expect a full defense of everything in that video. I've said this a million times, but I feel like I'm still going to be misconstrued here. The point is that Joe clearly did say that he was describing his intellectual journey. And so it's perfectly appropriate for me to then respond to how that's presented and what the nature of that journey was. And what was lacking was any evidence of an attempt to analyze the arguments and evidences that Joe was seeing or encountering from a diverse range of points of view, particularly from the point of view that he initially ostensibly held, like atheistic naturalism. He talks about dialoguing initially with Josh Rasmussen about the philosophical arguments, and later on with Cameron and Ethan Muse about the, Cameron Bertuzzi and Ethan Muse about the miracle side for Catholicism. And we don't get any mention of anyone else by name that he extensively dialogued with, that I recall. And so that's a huge bias there and seems to indicate a systematic problem with his process. But he also doesn't talk about how he evaluated particularly the miracle claims and the sort of skeptical process that I indicated that is appropriate for assessing these sorts of claims. He just Joe threw them all at us like a marketer, like a sort of a gish gallop. Not as examples of the sorts of things that convinced him, but almost to try to wow us with just the sheer number of things without showing us the process or talking about the process or illustrating how he tried to find what was true. The lack of that was telling for me, and I think is worthy of criticism because that's supposed to be the point of his channel. It's not like reasoning through things carefully, and people look up to him. So it's I think appropriate to say, look, the process that you illustrated here was really not rigorous, was not skeptical, was not careful, and seemed almost designed, shall we say, predisposed to deliver a certain conclusion. Catholicism, because that's all that was ever considered, apparently. No other forms of Christianity or forms of theism were discussed in any significant way, which is another major omission. We didn't get any acknowledgement of the fact that he now no longer evidently holds animal suffering or other concerns to be sufficiently powerful objectives, even though originally that was why he deconverted. That was dropped completely. That's a major omission. Something that we should hear about how he reconciled that with what he now believes and how he evaluated that. We didn't get any mention of evidence for the Bible or historical claims that it makes or Jesus, resurrection, anything like that. Nothing about that. We didn't get any discussion of theology, how he makes sense of confusing theological claims about like the Trinity, for example, or incarnation, which I think are major issues with the Christian worldview. Of course, Christians have their things to say about this, but I think it's a major omission for someone like Joe, who talked about reading theology, to not say anything about how he came to think about that. Because those are concerns for me that I would have to overcome to become a Christian, is how to understand this confusing theology. That, I think, was a major omission, to say nothing about that. And there's another issue that was mentioned in some of the comments here that I wanted to address, which is that the Catholic Church has a number of positions about, he did mention sin and sort of Joe mentioned sin and made a vague reference to like moral intuitions or something like this, or moral mistakes. Like mistaken views. I forget exactly how we phrased it. But the Catholic Church has some very clear and very extreme, I would say, views about things like homosexuality, trans people, abortion, reproductive rights generally, contraception. And to put it bluntly, I would say that the church, the Catholic Church has some good views on other social issues like capital punishment and opposition to war. So to be congratulated there. But on some of these issues of sexual and reproductive ethics, they just have horrific views, which are incredibly, I would say, outdated, incredibly patriarchal, incredibly problematic and unhelpful from a social point of view, and causes a lot of suffering. Now, if someone is a Catholic and they want to defend the position that the church has, they can do that. And if Joe has his reasons for accepting these views, he can defend those. The thing is, too, the fact that he didn't mention any of that, he didn't bring that up as like, okay, look, this entails, becoming a Catholic, evidently, of a particular theological bent. I mean, there's different Catholics who say different things, but like, given what he said, it's sort of an elephant in the room not to mention anything about this. And I find that objectionable. That should have been part of his intellectual journey to at least consider these issues and see, look, what does this entail about what I have to believe about all of these things? And how plausible is that? And how does that, mitigate against other factors? To entirely omit that from this video, I think is a major omission and is highly problematic. Hopefully we will see more engagement with these issues in further videos, but I think it should have been at least mentioned here, at least highlighted as a concern, because it's definitely a concern that I would have if I was thinking about converting to Catholicism. So overall, a very disappointing video. There's a lot that should have been in there that was not. There's a bunch that was in there, like the laundry list of miracles wasn't needed, didn't really add to anything. Pick 1 or 2 examples and then highlight the process. That would have been much better. So very disappointed. I mean, I didn't expect to be persuaded, but that's not the point of this video. But what I was disappointed at was the sloppiness of the way in which the intellectual process was discussed, and the fact that he even shockingly mentioned some of Cameron's miracle videos, including the demonic ones as one of the factors, and long conversation with Ethan Muse about these miracle claims, many of which not even, like, plenty of Catholics don't even accept a lot of this stuff, and yet that was central to Joe's conversion. It just doesn't make sense that these peripheral issues would be so central to his conversion to Catholicism, and central issues like the Bible, moral teachings, resurrection, were just no part of the as well as like the broader theological questions about theism and suffering and things like that, just not mentioned at all. Really, really disappointing. Again, I do expect some of these issues will be dealt with in more detail in future videos, so I will be responding to those. I guess one upside to this is that my channel is I'm not going to have any shortage of content in my channel if Joe does indeed make good on his promise to produce like the most rigorous defense of theism and then Catholicism and other related miracles on the internet. Then that will certainly be plenty of fodder for me to respond to. But I do want to emphasize that it takes a really long time to respond thoughtfully and critically to particularly the miracle claims, because it requires working through a lot of documentation. Recently, I've done detailed responses regarding the Shroud of Turin, resurrection of Jesus. That's a continual process and project that I have, as well as the Fatima miracle. I need to do some of the other cases that Joe mentioned here, including the stigmata cases, some of the healing claims, Our Lady of Zaytun. I've only superficially aware of those. I haven't dug into the details yet. So that's something I need to do, particularly because Joe is popularizing it more seriously. So that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of work. And it is a bit overwhelming, actually, from speaking personally now, because there's just there are a few other channels that do some of this, and that's really good work. But there aren't many of us who are specifically like going into details and critically analyzing these sort of miracle claims from a naturalistic point of view. There's much less interest in doing that from this side than there is from like the Catholic side or whichever religious tradition it is. So it takes a long time, and you don't often see. I mean, some of the videos have done all right, but like you don't get $1,000 of Patreon donations for that sort of work. Let me put it that way. So anyway. So I guess the reason I mention that is just bear with me. There's a lot more content that comes out than I have time to respond to. So I have to do my best with the time that I have. I am trying to still write my naturalism book. I am working on that. In fact, I was going to do more of that today, but I felt that this video was important to respond to. So you got that instead. But that is actually going well and is on track to be finished first draft of this year, like final draft hopefully next year. So 2028 wouldn't be an unreasonable year for publication. I know that's still a ways away, but these things take time. So that is an ongoing project. And then I've also got my science podcast. I'll plug that, Science of Everything podcast. If you're interested in learning about how the natural world works, check that out. That's something I also do. Science communication, I think, is important. As I think this video illustrated for someone who evidently, like Joe, doesn't read science at all, because he mentioned nothing about that in his video. And I think science education is important, folks. Otherwise, you start to believe in like demonic possession and very silly things. Anyway. So yes, I have a lot of, I have a full-time job, got married earlier this year, so lots of things to do. I think I would like to work more with other YouTubers, skeptics, atheists, and so forth, who are putting out this sort of content. So maybe that's something I need to do better at it. Maybe distributing the work a bit more and collaborating, which could be useful. But anyway, I appreciate your support. Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in, and hopefully you found this enlightening, and yeah, this will be interesting in terms of how this changes up the online space. So I'll do my best. But just because I don't immediately respond to something that's come up, I wanted to get this video out pretty quickly. But like there'll be, here's a long video that's coming out soon, for example. It probably would take me quite some time to work through that content and produce a response. So do bear with me. I will do my best. I'll have a quick last check of chat here, and then I'll finish up if anyone has any last questions. Thanks very much, at Universe. Appreciate it. I do my best. There is lots more than I would like to. Oh, thanks for the dono. And yes, Nathan's still taking a sabbatical. You can look up his, what's it called? His Substack if you're interested in the reasons for that. I don't want to discuss that here, but hopefully he will be back soon and we can do some more BAs. This is interesting. If you're a naturalist, you have good reasons against. Oh, yeah, right. I misread that. You have good reasons against sinking thousands of hours into investigating miracle nonsense. Yeah, and that's why most naturalists don't do it. Most scientists don't do it. It's a very niche occupation. Engagement. I think it's important because it's important to. It's interesting. You learn about human psychology and sociology and things like that, and it's important to provide a robust response. I mean, it should be enough just to say, look, we don't really know, but you don't have a good explanation either. You have to make all these ad hoc assumptions about why God would do this. And I try to do that, but I think that's not persuasive to a lot of people. I think it should be, but it's not. You often need a good counter explanation. So that's why I try to work on that, because I think you do learn things about how the world actually works, and it helps people to see the process that you like work through when you talk that through. That's why I tried to do in the discussion with Ethan Muse. I don't think that came across as well as I'd hoped, partly because of the format. But anyway, the point is that I think it's useful to do that, but it's true that most naturalists couldn't care less and don't spend the time doing it. So it's one of the reasons why there's just so much of this slop out there and comparatively little good response to a lot of it, at least. It's difficult. Yes, agree. It will happen. Oh, I love this. Reason is and only ought to be the slave of the passions. Hume vindicated once again. Hume is always vindicated, my friend. It's all about Hume. Oh, I didn't actually know this, that he had been anti-abortion for at least 4 to 5 years. Oh, be interesting to hear further discussion about this. Of course, abortion is only one of the issues that one could raise there. Yes, thank you. Yes. I'll need to be more systematic about this. Let's. Yeah, I think we need to talk about this, particularly as well, Joe, obviously, and Ethan Muse getting a lot of time. These sorts of miracle claims, I mean, Cameron's been popularizing this as well. They seem to be, I mean, it's not even just that, like the whole UFOs stuff has gotten a lot of attention the last few years on YouTube. I think there's a lot of reasons why these sorts of claims are getting more attention sort of culturally. And they require a different type of response than the traditional, like, let's respond to the Kalam cosmological argument kind of thing. So, yeah, we need to rethink our approach. Sorry, just having a look at chat here. No worries. Thanks, everyone. Chill left-wing theists like me. Well, I appreciate chill theists. I don't actually have an objection to, I don't agree with theism. But I'm not interested in deconverting people from theism. But I am interested in teaching people how to think critically and be scientifically literate and think through their positions and be well-informed, which is why I found Joe's video so bad, so upsetting in some ways, because it seemed to be the antithesis of that. Obi can be back next week for his Capturing Christianity tier list video. Yes, well, we'll see. We'll see how I go. That's about argument. So that requires a bit less preparation because I already know more about that. So hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. Did the guy really go Catholic? Well, you can watch his video and my video, but yes, all appearances are to the oh yeah, their views on masturbation. Yeah, that's another issue that is that's a good example of where the Catholic Church is clearly anti-science, because the science doesn't support being anti-masturbation at all. The science support it's being actually helpful, and I mean the same could be said about essentially all of their sexual positions, as far as I know. So sorry, you may have forgotten. At the start of the video, Joe said that the Catholic Church is like pro-science, and I said, well, in some ways they are, like they're all right with evolution. But in other ways, not so much. And those would be some examples. Anywho, so I'm sure we'll see a divorce. Yeah, of course, that's another one. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Just looking at a few last. Yeah. He'll go through more detail in future videos about, I explained what I was responding to. Cool. Thanks, everyone. I think I'll end up there. Hope you found this video interesting. I'll talk to you when I stream next. So take care, everyone. Stay safe.